All right, and we are recording. Welcome everybody to a very special episode with two guests, Brian Berletic and Carl Zha. We've got a pretty super team here together, and we're going to be doing something really special. We're going to go through the 60 minutes video on the war with China piece that they put together. This epic, fear-mongering, dramatic music piece that went out to everybody. And I got, no joke, about 20 messages from people saying, did you see this? Did you see this? And some people are legitimately scared by it. I had an author also, a pretty famous author who's connected with me, sent it to me, said, did you see this? It was done a lot better than they did a 60 minutes China fear-mongering special. Well, they've done a lot of them. They did one that was focusing on New Zealand, kind of going after New Zealand for not joining them. And it was so ridiculous. Where they were talking about, we thought they were our friends. And it was just this super melodramatic thing. And I think they got made fun of so much that they upped their game here. And this really is a pretty scary piece that they put out. And this is what we're going to do. So first of all, my audience, you know what, actually, before we go in, I'm making an assumption that my audience knows you guys, and everybody who subscribes to me does. But for the sake of anybody who's joining in who is not a subscriber to my channel, you want to do a brief introduction? Maybe Carl, I'll start with you.
Okay, hi, I'm Carl Zha. I run a podcast about China called the Silk and Steel Podcast on the political history, culture, and politics of China and surrounding regions. And I have a Twitter account, which I'm very active on. So you can follow me there.
Right. Yeah, and it's a great podcast. Definitely recommend it. And Brian.
My name is Brian Berletic. I used to write under the pen name Tony Cartolucci for about 10 years. I was running the Land Destroyer blog. Now I run newatlas.report, and I have a YouTube channel, The New Atlas, and I do geopolitical analysis videos 5 times a week.
Perfect. Yeah. All right. So now that we're up to speed on that, what we're going to do is we're actually going to watch the entire 60 minutes video. But for the purposes of keeping this within fair use policies, I will let the kind of copyright reviewers know this is not for commercial purposes. It is not going to be a monetized video. It's for educational purposes, and it does not replace the need to watch the original video. This is more supplementary. And actually, I would even go as far as saying it's required that people watch the original video. What we're going to do to protect ourselves even more is while we're watching the video, we're actually going to fast forward and post through the parts that we're watching. But what I'll do is I'll put on the screen or mention beforehand and afterhand what is the minute markers we are looking at, so you can understand fully what we're reacting to. I will leave the most important pieces in there, but it will be essential for you to maybe, this will be a little bit of a test. I haven't seen anybody do this before, but maybe it's a good idea to have the other video up beside this. And when you see the minute markers we're referring to, you can follow along with us because you won't see the entire footage in this video. Otherwise, it reduces the need for you to go and watch it on their channel, which would be then get us into copyright issue territory. So we won't share. We've all watched this once beforehand ourselves, and we are just itching to dig into this. We have a lot of things to say about it. What we'll do now is we'll start playing the video. And as we're playing the video, Brian or Carl, if there's something specific, because I've got the controls here, that you want me to stop on, put your hand up and just say, hey, pause here, and then we'll have our discussion and continue on. So without further ado, let's just dive right into it.
China. It sounds unthinkable, but according to many experts, the countdown may be on. America and its allies are preparing for a battle we didn't think was possible.
The idea that China would never attack, even never invade, well, I wouldn't count on that.
Can I jump in here?
All right, so we went up to the 50-second mark. Go ahead, Brian.
So they're saying this is a conflict they didn't think was coming. They have been planning this for decades. The U.S. has policy paper on top of policy paper about waging war on China specifically to encircle and contain it. And what they're going to do throughout this entire, not to spoil it or anything, but they're trying to twist the entire narrative around where China is being constrained by a foreign military power that is right up to its coast. And they are trying to push them out in a very rational way that any other country would if it was in their place. And if this was all turned around and China was doing this to the U.S., the U.S. would be pushing back. They would never tolerate, Chinese military forces clamoring right off their coast. They would never tolerate that. And I just want to point out that they're taking all of the warmonger propaganda and they're posing it as fact. And this is how the debate is going to be run. This entire episode. That is the basis. It's just this pure war propaganda. They never question it. So that's the starting point. So it's a debate based on war propaganda. They never question the propaganda itself.
Go ahead.
I like to follow up on that. They made a statement about countering China's aggression in the Pacific. I'd like to know what specific aggressions China have carried out against the Pacific Ocean. I would like to know that. But like Brian said, that they just post it as a fact. They don't even question it.
Yeah, there was we had played a clip on Brian and I. We did our last video where there was a guy on CNN, one of the reporters. He was like really confused and he felt a bit shy and embarrassed to ask this question. But he was like, why exactly are we doing this? What is China doing? And then the guy was going on, about, possibly stopping trade routes and all of this possible dangers and things like that. And then the host, very shyly asked, well, have they done any of that yet? And he's like, no, not yet. So it's like, it's all about theory. It's all, and one of the points I was honing on with Brian, it's all imagining that China will one day do what the U.S. is already doing, putting blockades on places or sanctioning them or preventing them from getting essential goods. Like, this is stuff that the U.S. already does. They're inadvertently admitting that they shouldn't be doing this. And those are strong words in the beginning. So obviously they have the dramatic music, and they have the guy that's going as far as saying that, don't count on it, that China won't invade Australia. Like, where is there even the slightest indication of that? I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. And on the contrary, on the flip side, America invading China, training people in Camp Hale, Colorado, and deploying rebels into Tibet. They also had the clandestine operations in Fujian province when they were releasing rebels from the Taiwanese-controlled islands, the KMT-controlled islands at that point, to distract China while the Korean War was going on. Like, this is stuff that America has already tried to do, and there's been no indication that China wants to do this to the West. I don't know if you guys had anything else to add before I continue pressing play.
Yeah, no, because that Air Force colonel, what he was basically saying was China threatens all the trade routes, but then he was talking about trade routes that China absolutely depends on and would never disrupt. And what he's admitting is that this AUKUS alliance, all of this actual buildup against China is the U.S. and its allies poising to disrupt Chinese trade in a limited conflict to crush China's economy, because that is the only way they're going to prevent them from surpassing them. And the Rand Corporation document spells that out explicitly in over 100 pages.
Right. You know what? Actually, this is probably I was planning on sharing one short 2-minute clip at the end of this, but actually this is probably a good place to start so you can understand the framing as we're going through this. So when you're hearing these stories about Australia getting these subs and stuff like that, and you're hearing this guy on this special saying China could attack, I want you to hear what Paul Dibb, he's a previous Australian intelligence official, and a current strategic defense professor. So this is what he said in 2015, and pay close attention. He is admitting that there's no way China's going to invade. There's no indication that China's going to invade Australia, but Australia could help out in case China ever fights with the U.S. So it's about Australia fighting another one of the America's wars. They could help out by blocking the trade routes for China. And I'll let you listen to that first, and then it will give you a good framing before we continue on with this.
Defence force for war with China. Beijing is not developing the conventional forces with which to invade or directly attack Australia. But we should develop the high technology naval and air assets, including submarines, necessary to contribute to any allied conflict in the region, including in Northeast Asia, where we might need to make a contribution or where Australia needs to help resist Chinese military adventurism. Developing these capabilities will further complicate the strategic and operational environment for a still isolated China. which in turn will place further constraints on and likely encourage greater caution from Beijing. In Northeast Asia, this would suggest for Australia niche contributions from us in such areas as submarines and air power. Our army cannot make a difference to conflict outcomes in Northeast Asia. Closer to home, however, we could make a much more substantial contribution by having the capability to block the straits of Southeast Asia in the event of a serious war in Northeast Asia involving the United States.
So, as you can see, there is no real threat, but when you get close enough to a war, I don't think it's good enough to get your people on board in Australia and just say, we need to be there for America if this poking China all the time ends up in a war with China and America. And we've got to do something to help them. We've got to try to block China's trade routes and stuff like that. I don't think that's enough to get Australian people on board. That's where this next level propaganda needs to come in, where you're saying they could attack us at any time. We're at risk, even though they know that that's not true. So, yeah, maybe I'll continue on because we've got quite a bit to get through. So, and there's going to be quite a few additional things that come up. So let's go.
Ready on a collision course with his own people. From recently outlawing boy bands to enforcing propaganda lessons in primary schools. Xi Jinping is taking control, and he's prepared to fight for it even beyond his homeland.
Boy bands. I don't think that's, I mean, I haven't been following that story much, but I don't know if you know more about that, Carl. And I've got 3 kids in primary school here. They haven't been coming home singing any communist hymns or anything like that yet. But I mean, people seem pretty happy here. I mean, I don't know. They're complaining on behalf of the Chinese people now. I don't know if you've been following any of these stories, Carl.
I just like them to name one specific boy band that China had banned. I mean, like they made a very general, very strong statement. You know, I just wish they can just name one boy band that China has just banned.
Right. Yeah. No, it's crazy. I don't think they'll be able to do that. Let's keep going. We're continuing from the 1 minute, 10 second mark.
If this unimaginable conflict were to happen, it would begin with an invasion of Taiwan, the tiny nation off its coast that China has long believed is theirs.
Once they make the decision to do this, they will come full bore, like a crazy man with an axe.
Control of Taiwan would give China a huge new military reach over the Pacific.
That would...
Okay, hold on a second. I got to pause that there. I paused that at 1 minute, 35 seconds. A huge new military reach. Taiwan is 100 miles off of the coast of China, and then another 100 miles to the east coast of Taiwan. I mean, they've got islands that go out further than that. That's an amazing additional reach into the Pacific Ocean.
It doesn't make any sense. And I have personal experience talking to people in America who have no idea that Taiwan is not a real country. They honestly believe that it is an independent country. They believe that the U.S. has an embassy there, because when they do things like this, they never really explain that there is no embassy there. Taiwan does not have embassies in other countries, not in the U.S. And people are shocked when they find out that this is not true, that it's not a country, there is no embassy, because they think that if that were true, wouldn't the media say that? And this is how the Western media has duped the West and the world into so many wars, because it's not that they're just lying, but they also do these lies of omission. And they've been doing this with Taiwan for literally decades now.
Right.
Brian, I think you're giving too much credits to the U.S. public. As far as I know, many people in U.S. cannot tell the difference between Taiwan and Thailand.
That's true. I've been asked, how's life in Taiwan? It's true.
Yeah.
That is true.
Yeah, I mean, you know what? I think there's definitely going to be some instigation going on here with Taiwan, and I don't know what's going to happen with it. I had an episode with you, Brian, where I was saying I really hope that the status quo can be maintained, but I think China knows that Taiwan will be used against China. This is going to be, and it was before, like I said, during the Korean War, and I mean, things are definitely getting messy there, but it would be it's far more of strategic importance to the U.S. in terms of military adventurism than it is to China. But yeah, you're right. There's a lot of details that are left out of this. So let's continue on from the 1 minute 35.
Under investigation.
All right, here we go. Now it's starting.
Daniel, can I jump in here real quick before it gets started?
Right.
Do you want me to kind of give a background of who these characters are?
Yeah, sure. Sure. There's a bunch of people that showed up already, and I know you said you were going to look into them. I know that last guy that was on there because I already retweeted one of his tweets, and we'll get to that exactly what that was about in a second. But of course, you've got Aspie in there. You know, the nefarious, the over and over again, military-industrial complex funded think tank that gains a lot to benefit when the Australian society is feared into saying, yeah, we definitely need all of this military equipment that's manufactured by the sponsors of this think tank who's feeding us stories telling us we need to be scared. But yeah, so you go ahead, let us know what you found, or if you need a screen share. I think you got a screen here, right? All right.
Yeah. So one of the characters that's going to pop up often is this Grant Newsham. And you can see he's from the Center for Security Policy. And it's going to become very clear what he's doing when you see this. Besides writing for Epoch Times, just this crazy anti-China war propaganda. And this guy, his article echoes almost verbatim Matthew Pottinger, that Deputy National Security Advisor, all of the things he said that we discussed in a previous video. But who is running this Center for Security Policy? Frank Gaffney, one of these inveterate neocon warmongers. He's signed off on every war, every crime against humanity the U.S. government has perpetrated last century and this century. And there's this Salon article about this specific think tank that he set up. And this was about, look who's backing Islamophobe Frank Gaffney. And they go into all of these, look who it is: Boeing, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and General Electric. So kind of like a little Aspie. And what were they doing when Salon wrote this article? What year was this? 2014. This was them still drumming up Islamophobia against all Muslims all around the globe to grease the skids, to keep the war on terror going. They're doing the exact same thing against all Asian people, not just Chinese people. They're doing the exact same thing, this toxic, racist anger, fear, hatred, so that they could grease the skids for this limited conflict they want to fight against China to knock it down. So it's very out. So that's one guy. This was the one you were talking about, Daniel, Dr. Malcolm Davis. This is his profile on Aspie. There's John Lee, the United States Studies Center, which is funded by the U.S. government and the Australian government. He's also at the Hudson Institute. And who funds the Hudson Institute? Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office, which is their de facto embassy because it's not a real country. So that's what they have. The Japan Foundation, etc. So, I mean, I think people can see the pattern here. Then there's two guys from this Future Operations from UNSW. This is Australian University, and it's connected to this right here, the Australian Defence Force Academy. So there's this guy, Clinton Fernandez, and David Kilcullen, and he was involved in all of these wars that Australia was fighting alongside the U.S., all these failed wars that just mass murdered people in the hundreds of thousands, just cut a swath of death and destruction from North Africa to Central Asia. Let's see, who else? That guy, this guy in the video, he will say they need to sink the entire Chinese fleet. So he is Captain James.
I've got something to say about that because there's a real interesting contrast that comes after that, and we'll get to that in a sec. But this is amazing. You know, they framed it as this open debate of different people coming together with different ideas, and they're like all connected to the military-industrial complex. They're all laughing all the way to the bank when people are scared and think there's a nuclear war coming and that they need to build up their military for the most part. And they do, a couple of them try to add some nuance in, like the two Asian looking guys were like, oh, we better be careful about this. We're going to end up in a camp just like the Japanese were, but at the end of the day, it's pretty superficial pushback. They do add, I think they really tried to add a little bit of balance. They talk about the bases, which we'll get to in a second in Australia. But really, at the end of the day, these are all, they look like these look like these are guys who are going to be pretty happy about the ramped up fears that are going on.
So I think about out of 7 people, there was like 1.5 people advocating peace and kind of pushing it back against the propaganda, because this guy, he's from the Chinese Australian Forum. He was his arguments were very weak. He kind of was making many concessions. The only guy who was really making any points at all was Dr. David Brophy.
Right.
So he was one guy in the middle of a debate where the debate is based on unchallenged war propaganda, and he's the only voice of reason trying to push back. And who got the last word at the end of this? Well, we'll find out. Was it David Brophy and his message of peace, or was it the military-industrial complex funded warmongers? Okay, right. So I just wanted to do that. Sorry.
That's perfect. That's a good way to set it up for people to know who we're dealing with here. A lot of these guys, when they're working for ASPI, and they're doing their propaganda and things like that, people need to know these kinds of connections, these kinds of conflicts of interest. I mean, if people think that regular Chinese state media journalists are dangerous enough that they need to be labeled as state media, Chinese state media, I honestly think people who are shilling for the military industrial complex need a special label also, so people clearly know what kinds of conflicts of interest are going on there as well. That's an even more dangerous conflict of interest, because Chinese journalists aren't trying to convince anybody that they need to go somewhere else in the world and slaughter people in another country. But the people who are trying to sell you military equipment are. So I think this is good. This is really good. This is something that all viewers should know, but unfortunately, most people are just going to be walking away from this 60 Minutes special crapping themselves basically in fear without knowing that, oh, hold on a second, there's some shady characters here. So let's continue on. We're going to continue from the 2-minute and 20-minute.
Remains Australia's firm view that understanding the cause of this pandemic has nothing to do with politics. It's essential for preventing the next one.
And China.
I'm just going to pause this at 4 minutes and 56 seconds for a second. It's important to note that I know a lot of the pushback from China came from the way that it was framed, how they were coming after China about this COVID stuff. It wasn't done in a mutually respectful way. It wasn't done in a balanced way. It was just like, we really want to nail this on China. We want to go after China. And China ultimately opened up their labs and opened up their country to the WHO inspectors. And there's been millions of people who want the same kind of a thing to go on the America side, but they're not going to play ball with that. I don't know I can't remember, Carl, if you covered some stuff on that about how it was, or if it was somebody else I saw covering it. They're talking about how unreasonable it would be to expect China to play ball with that kind of rhetoric. I think they were aligned with Pompeo's kind of a framing when they were saying, you need to open up and tell us exactly what went on now, kind of in an accusatory way.
I think it's somebody else, but the whole line of the so-called lab leak theory, that was first propped up by Matt Pottinger, who was a Trump's deputy security advisor, national security advisor. And Matt Pottinger himself, he was in charge of the initial U.S. response to COVID. And we know how that disastrous effort went. And to shift blame, that's when Matt Pottinger went to all his media cronies like Josh Rogan in Washington Post and start pushing hard for this lab leak theory from Wuhan. So they really want to pin the origin COVID to China. This is really just an effort to shift the blame. I mean, this is very obvious. And Biden administration continue this policy even after taking power from Trump because U.S. is still not out of the woods with COVID yet, with the new Delta virus. And it's very convenient to play politics. So what Scott Morrison said was actually not true. What Australia was doing, trying to pin the blame on China, has everything to do with politics. It has nothing to do with how to learn how to control the pandemic in the future. I mean, Australia, if anything, if Australia really wanted to learn, they could have just copycat what China have done, because China actually successfully contained COVID and the new Delta virus spread. So instead of doing that, all the Western government right now is looking to shift blames.
I think one of the things that's probably even more spectacular is that if you look at how Australia is treating anti-lockdown crowds, with riot police going and beating people and shooting them with rubber bullets and stuff like that, and then even like China didn't do anything like this, and then they have the nerve to say, "Oh, look at this!" Like some of their own journalists were saying, "Wow, we're really dealing with this in a Chinese way." And I know what's his name, the China Daily Chief Bureau, the firecracker guy,
Chen Weihua.
That's right, Chen Weihua.
Yeah.
He just said bullshit. You show me where we did this. You show me where we did this during our pandemic controls. So that was kind of funny.
Yeah, I saw a tweet earlier that went a little bit viral. Somebody said Australian police really behaving like the People's Liberation Army. I'm like, I don't remember if PLA did that during the COVID pandemic, anything like that. You go ahead and forward me the footage. Yeah.
Did you have something to add, Brian?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, it was the president of the United States calling it China virus. So they started by accusing China, and then they worked their way backwards, trying to come up with evidence. And it's the exact same thing they did to Iraq. They decided they were going to invade, and then they worked their way backwards for a pretext. And because they didn't have one, they were just making stuff up. And I think people can see this. And so China obviously saw straight through it. Everyone sees straight through it. Everyone who's not still on the bandwagon with the West and their wars can see through this. And so what China did in reaction to Australia, it's very reasonable. Why should they sit there and let us? Because that's what Australia was doing. They were just on the leash, and the U.S. said attack, and that's what they were doing. It had nothing to do with getting to the bottom of anything.
Yeah, and you would see also, if this was really about an honest attempt to find the origins, I mean, we've already found traces of COVID and sewage in Italy and Spain and all these places that go back before the first time we knew about it in China. There would be equal effort to say, wow, okay, what's going on here? It doesn't necessarily mean it came from there. And granted, if people really want to say, well, maybe it came from China even earlier. Yeah, maybe it did. But this is something we should investigate also. But nobody's giving that much focus or attention to that because it doesn't fit the political goal. Because as Carl said, it's absolutely 100% political. So let's continue on here from the 4-minute and 56-second mark.
Has bitten back, hitting us with punishing trade sanctions. Are we talking ourselves into a war? Or are we bravely standing up to an aggressive China?
I think what's important to note when they say that there have been trade implications to this conflict between Australia and China, what would have been a really honest piece of journalism there is to say, and by the way, America is the beneficiary of a lot of this fallout, because now the stuff that we used to be selling to China, America's selling to China, even though they're the ones that are pushing us into this conflict. But that would be very inconvenient to the overarching issue or goal here to get Australians on board to fight a war that has nothing to do with them, that's between potentially the U.S. and China, even if that happens. We have a buzzing noise coming through. I'm not sure if it's on...
I think that's Carl's fan oscillating. Is your fan oscillating back and forth?
Yeah. Let me fix my fan. Hold on 1 second.
Okay. Yeah. Even your fan is listening to this 60 Minutes piece, and it's just bugging out.
Groaning. It's groaning. I can't believe it.
If you want to continue, Brian, in the meantime.
I was just gonna share this with the trade that Australia had with China. This was So Australia's export markets, and you could see how huge this export market is for Australia. And then, of course, imports is not insignificant either. It's their very significant trade partners. And even if you look at China, even though you would think like Australia is kind of a small country, but they're importing a lot of stuff from Australia. And so why would they do this? I always like to compare it to someone has a very good business partner that's helping them make a lot of money, and then one day they just wake up and decide they're going to push them down the stairs. I mean, this is what Australia is doing to China, and you have to ask yourself. Well, you don't have to ask yourself because we kind of went over it. Farmers are going to suffer. The miners, all of these, everyone that's actually engaged in constructive industry in Australia's economy, they're all going to lose out. Who is the beneficiary of this? Who's benefiting from this? And the answer is all of those defense contractors. They're not going to make money in a time of peace and prosperity and trade. They're going to make money, and they're going to gain control, maintain power, expand their power through war. So it's very simple.
Yeah, no, definitely. This is something that would have been some valuable context to add into the entire conversation there. Well, let's continue here. Let's see where we were.
The military upgrades that we're talking about, the extra spending on our defense forces, we can afford this stuff because of our really profitable trade with China.
He doesn't ask a question. He says, it's really funny because the reason we can afford this is because of our trade with China, because, it's a very profitable relationship. And the host, I remember this, she ends up asking the ASPI connected guy, is that true? He doesn't answer the question. He just deflects and goes on to something else to try to justify it all.
Is that true, Malcolm?
The decision to spend money on defence is based on threat perception, and that threat perception is focused exclusively on a rising China. We no longer have 10 years strategic warning time for a major attack on this country. The ball is in their court. They need to actually realise that they are responsible for the crisis that we're now in, not us.
I mean, they're trading. They're both benefiting. No one benefits from disrupting that trade, and yet Australia has decided to do it. They immediately face consequences for it. China faces consequences for unpleasant consequences that they don't benefit from. They have to diversify away from things they depended on Australia for. And this guy is talking about threat perception. What threat is he talking about? He's talking about, and we could go into this too, about how the West colonized Asia and how there's still this legacy of imperialism still in the region. Western military forces, thousands of miles from their own shores, are still in Asia. You have tens of thousands of forces based in South Korea and in Japan. Guam, this is an island the U.S. took over. Hawaii is an island the U.S. took over. The Philippines was colonized by the U.S. up until 1946. Hong Kong was only handed back to China in 1997 by the British. So what the threat is them losing their foothold right off of China's coast. That is the threat. But that is not something that a country should mobilize to war for. That is something they should reflect on and think about how to transition.
Yeah, and other than direct interventions, you've got indirect also. Like we're still reconciling what happened in East Timor. I mean, that's a genocide that the U.S. supported, and that's a country that was also devastated by Australia and cheated by Australia. There's also West Papua. There's all of these places also with indirect action that would say, you know what, if anybody's the threat here, it's these Western powers that we're talking about. The things that they're imagining China may eventually do, they've already done on a way worse scale in recent history. I don't know, Carl, did you have something you wanted to add there?
They keep on talking about China threat to Australia and China's intention to attack Australia. I don't know if the average Australian is as bad in geography as your average Americans, but there's a giant country sitting in between Australia and China. Australia don't even border China. There's a whole country of Indonesia that sits north of Australia. And right now, Australians are more scared of China than the Indonesians and Malaysians who actually share border with China, who actually have, like Malaysia actually have an active dispute with China in South China Sea. These are the countries that, you know, you would think that have a fear of China. But Australia, being on the other side of the hemisphere, is for some reason think China is a threat. You know, but somehow China is going to leapfrog the whole country of Indonesia to get to Australia. But okay, so that's my rant. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
No, I want to kind of build. Can I build on that a little bit, because I just think it's interesting. They formed this
while you're talking, Brian. I'm going to refresh my connection. You guys keep going. I've just got to refresh my connection. You guys keep going.
Okay. I was going to say it's interesting when they formed this AUKUS alliance, and the actual just like you're saying, Carl, the countries that are actually right there along China's periphery, some of them literally sharing a land border with China, they're not interested in any of this. Even countries that have disputes in the South China Sea, they're not interested in conflict, because if we looked at the trade between these countries and China, it's all a very similar story. Huge export market, a lot of imports, infrastructure. They have military deals, so they might have like these disputes, these maritime disputes, but they have all of these with each other as well. None of them were interested in joining some U.S.-led coalition to stir up trouble with China. None of them. So the U.S. really is scraping the outer edges of the region, and even the U.K., which that's not even remotely associated with the Pacific in any way, and yet UK, Australia, the US, it's so absurd. It's so transparent. They're saying they're protecting the region. No one asked them for protection. They're inserting themselves into the middle of this, in the middle of multiple countries, not just China.
I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, like, if you look, the South China Sea is often brought up in the context of talking about China. But if you look at, you know, the people surrounding South China Sea, people who actually have active dispute with China, you have Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, all these countries have publicly said, you know, latest it was been Vietnam. They said they're not interested in joining U.S. in containing China. They made a public statement. Either Vietnam or Philippines, Malaysia, all these countries bordering South China Sea said they do not want to participate in an anti-China alliance with U.S. Regardless, South China Sea issue is still being used as like the reason why Anglo countries like US, Australia, and UK must intervene.
Yeah, there was a good point that you brought up too, Brian, before, which was when even the U.S. dragged the Philippines into a court case in Europe, which they didn't even really want to be a part of, and they ended up kind of ignoring it and just resolving it on their own terms with China. They're constantly trying to insert themselves into this. Did you have a screen you need to share or not?
Yeah, because they're gonna bring this up too. What people might not realize is that Taiwan has almost an identical claim over the entire South China Sea as mainland China, and they never talk about that. And this is a New York Times article after that show tribunal that the U.S. organized for the Philippines that the Philippines didn't even use. And Taiwan rejected the outcome of the tribunal also, along with Beijing, because they claim all of that as well. And they never really talk about this. You have to do a lot of digging to get to the bottom of this. And I always show people articles from, like this is Taipei Times, and they're talking about it's an 11-dash line. You never hear about this. And it's virtually the exact same claim as mainland China. And this isn't like Global Times or something. This is the government there admitting this, and they don't want to talk about it. They try to not mention it because they understand the implications. If people pick up on this, how that will undermine this war propaganda that they're pushing.
Yeah, that was something I had to double check with Carl also when we were talking before, because I said, well, hold on a second, because I think it was either in this documentary, this 60-minute special or something else, where they were saying that China's claims are expanding. And I asked Carl, because, I mean, Carl's like the walking encyclopedia for this kind of stuff. I said, well, hold on a second. isn't their claim less than what it was with the previous governments? And you said that it indeed was, didn't you, Carl?
Yes, in fact, the 11 dash line was the original KMT government claim to the South China Sea. In the current PRC claim, the 11 dash line become 9 dash line because there were this extra 3 dash line goes up to the Gulf of Tonkin, between Vietnam and China. China and Vietnam actually settled their maritime border in the Gulf of Tonkin. So that 3 dash line got removed. So now it's just 9 dash line. That's how the 11. So how the our so-called ROC's 11 dash line became 9 dash line. And as Brian mentioned, the China PRC basically inherited its claim to South China Sea from its previous government, the KMT government.
Yeah, and it was either in this documentary or another one. They said that the claim began when the Chinese, the Communist Party of China took over, and I was like, no, hold on a second. But they said it so confidently, and they presented it in such a way that even I was second guessing my knowledge, and I said, Carl, this isn't true, is it? And you're like, yeah, nah, it's
yeah, it's this documentary. They'll get to it.
America's position is slipping. And I think it's really unthinkable for a lot of people in Canberra, particularly in the defence sector, that Australia could be left alone without America in the neighbourhood in a position to help out if Australia gets itself in trouble. But there is no military threat from China to Australia. I mean, I want to state that very clearly.
Look at China's.
You're absolutely right, Brian. This is the most reasonable person out of them all. And he makes a very valid point there that probably won't register with a lot of people. That America definitely is in decline. And if Australia continues to do the bidding of the U.S. and all of this instigation, and America is still in the condition that it's in and getting worse, absolutely, Australia could be left on their own. They'd be like, why did we do this? But, there isn't enough of this reason that's going into this special, and they kind of brush over it.
They claim all of the South China Sea. If China achieves that, the way the region operates changes fundamentally. China spends more on its military than the whole of Asia combined.
He's absolutely right. It's about China.
I think you have something to say there, Brian. 8 minutes and 11 seconds.
I mean, the U.S. spends more than China, Russia, and I think like the next several countries combined. And they're saying China spends more than other countries in Asia. Why is this? Because the countries in Asia don't perceive China as a threat to themselves, and China is reacting to what? What is their navy mirroring? The navies that are located in Asia, or the U.S. that has sent their navy to thousands of miles from their own shores, right off the coast of China. It's so obvious what's going on here. Yeah, there you go. So there you go.
Like, come on. What really? You're surprised? You're surprised about this? And you make a valid point, because a lot of U.S. military spending goes into this infrastructure here also. So they're obviously comparing China against all of these other countries in the region that aren't under threat by the U.S., at least in the same way that China is. But they're not considering the amount of U.S. funds that go into their operations in this region as well, which is equally valid. But,
and you want to show that this statistic, because I think that a bar graph makes it very clear. This is what the U.S. is spending on military. That's what China is spending. I think they have to triple their spending just to match the United States. And then you could just see, like, even if you added all of those other countries below China together with China, they would still have to catch up to the U.S. So the way they're framing this, there's so much context that they're leaving out, and China is obviously investing in its military because of the United States. The United States openly, in their own defense papers, their defense policy review, says China by name is the threat that they're focused on. And then just look at the 60 Minutes piece. I mean, it's obvious what they're reacting to.
Right, yeah. And when you look at that number, when you look at that amount of spend in the United States, and you combine that with the knowledge that there's this pivot to Asia, and China is America's target, that's the spending there that China needs to be worried about. And even with that in mind, look how small China's spending is in regards to that. I mean, it's mostly going into defense mechanisms. I saw some Kishore Mahbubani's book, Has China Won, has some really interesting stats in there about these missiles along China's coast that are meant to basically sink aircraft carriers that come too close to China's shore, or in the event of an invasion. And it compared like this $30,000 rocket that could sink this multi-billion-dollar ship. So they don't have to spend as much because they're not really focusing on an offensive. They're focusing on defensive. And I think that's really important to note as well. So we'll continue from that point in that video.
John, are we seeing China bullying Australia into thinking, at least, that there's trouble coming?
The grand narrative of the Chinese Communist Party certainly is that, one, China is undeterrable. Two, its goals are fixed. And three, it will pay any cost to achieve those goals.
I'm going to pause that there for a second, the 943, because he didn't really answer her question on whether China was bullying or fearing Australia into believing there's a conflict coming. That's literally what the show is. The show is literally fearing Australians into thinking there's a conflict coming. The think tanks that some of these guys sit on, like ASPI, are literally trying to fear people into thinking a conflict is coming. I mean, that's where the fearing and the fear mongering is coming from. I don't know if you guys had anything to add to that, or we just continue on.
I just want to add in that they're trying to act as if China just has this chip on its shoulder regarding Australia. And I just want to point out some facts that Chinese students make up the largest number of foreign students studying in Australia. Chinese tourists are number two. They're number two after New Zealand, and New Zealand benefits from proximity to Australia. So the second largest number of tourists coming to Australia are from China. The Chinese people, China in general, likes Australia. They want to do business with Australia. They want to travel there. They want to study there. And we can see that it was Australia who decided to throw. They're saying Australia is a punching bag. Punching bags don't hit back, and they definitely don't hit first. But this is what Australia did. They precipitated this. And Malcolm is saying, don't bend the knee to Beijing. But aren't they bending their knee to Washington? I just think that's an interesting point to make.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of people here in China, as this was ramping up, they were literally they were shocked that Australia had this aggression towards China. They were like, "What?" We're like, "We thought we were, I thought everything was like we like each other. We love Australia. Why would what's going on here?" They were completely perplexed. But,
it's like in a high school drama movie or something where they're best friends, but then the one gets a chance to be in the cool club, so he picks on his friend, and there's like this moment of like betrayal, and they're like, "What just happened there? I don't get it." It's kind of like that.
And the person that was abandoned was literally your neighbor, also, not only your good friend, but your neighbor in your own,
To say, stay out of it because it's just hopeless to put up any resistance, and you might as well stay on the sidelines and deal with China as China wants to be dealt with.
I do think it is very dangerous to frame China as completely evil, only malevolent. Trying to frame China as like worse than Darth Vader.
Yes, I agree with all of that, but at what point do you decide you can't just keep stepping back?
No, we shouldn't step back.
So is resistance futile?
No, it's not futile.
So this is, I'm going to pause this at the 10-minute and 18-second mark. They're talking about, okay, we shouldn't just paint China as evil. And then the host asks, well, does that mean we should, just continue stepping back? These are all like, they're not actually putting any examples in front of people. Like, this doesn't mean anything. They're just using figures of speech. And if you actually pressure them like that CNN host awkwardly did, saying, well, what exactly are you talking about here? Like Carl was saying, can you give me a specific example? It's like they're just talking in these general terms that are completely out of touch with reality.
Yeah, it's like stepping back, bend the knee. Like, please tell me when did Xi Jinping forward the request for Australia to bend the knee? I like to see that memo. And stepping back from what? I mean, what? It totally doesn't make sense.
What was the? Do you remember what were the? Because the only thing I can think of that they would possibly refer to is the grievances. Like China listed a number of grievances they had with Australia. I can't remember exactly. It was a while ago what they were, but I think that's what a reasonable conversation sounds like. You say, okay, listen, these are the problems we have. Let's work through them. I don't know if you remember exactly what some of those were.
I remember there's a list. I could try to look it up right now. But one thing they're going to talk about in this documentary is Taiwan and the South China Sea. Australia is not a claimant in the South China Sea, and Taiwan is none of their business. So these are two flashpoints that Australia is electing to insert itself into, that it has no business being involved in. And why are they doing that? Because the U.S. is doing that. And she'll even say, wherever the U.S. goes, Australia goes. She even says it in this piece.
Right.
So I mean, there you have it.
I'll continue playing this as you're looking that up if you don't have it in front of you yet, and then when we get to the next pause point, you can mention those items.
It is China, after all, that rolls nuclear ballistic missiles through Tiananmen Square on National Day parades and tanks and displays their military might.
So America has 15 times more nuclear warheads than China has. And they've actually used nuclear bombs on civilian populations twice. But China's fraction of nuclear warheads that has never been used on a civilian population is more scary because it goes on a parade.
And a parade inside China, right?
Yeah,
right.
I mean, like, how does what China does inside China's borders even remotely offends Australian sensibility? I mean, it boggles the mind.
And then the U.S. does their own parade through the South China Sea with these freedom of navigation operations. That's exactly what it is. It's a show of power thousands of miles from U.S. shores, deliberately to provoke China. I got the list too, by the way.
Okay, yeah, let's hear what some of those were.
So some of them were Australia kind of, basically accusing China of being the origin and responsible for COVID-19. That's a big one. Injecting itself into the South China Sea, which we just talked about, which obviously Australia has no business doing. The accusations that China's carrying out all of these cyber attacks, again, just parroting Washington. And then the banning of Huawei and the rollout of 5G because of the U.S. claiming that there were all these security concerns. And these are all very legitimate grievances China has with Australia, because all Australia is doing is repeating and amplifying what the U.S. has done. And we know what the U.S. is doing. They're doing the same thing they do every single time. 2003, lead up to Iraq invasion. They're lying to undermine a country they don't like and that they want to knock down a peg. That's all they're doing, and Australia is helping. So that's the origin of these grievances China has with Australia.
What's really important to note about that too is that, I mean, first of all, that's the way you do things. You say, okay, we've got a problem with you, and here's the list of the problems we have. We think this is unfair. And when Australia is doing it, they're not actually giving any specifics. They're talking in these general terms. They're talking about things that China hasn't done yet, that they're afraid they will one day do. And China's here coming with a list with actual physical things that they can prove. They can say, listen, these are the things you're doing, and we have a problem with it. Let's have a discussion about this. I mean, you can see clearly which side is using diplomacy and which side is just being, ignorant and shallow.
And in speeches threatens that they'll bash the heads of Westerners against a great wall of steel.
The Chinese people will never allow any foreign forces to bully us. Anyone who dares to try will have their heads bashed bloody against a great wall of steel.
You know what? Okay, I gotta pause this at 11:17. This is, I mean, there's so much wrong with this, but I gotta just say the voice that they found for this.
I was
just
gonna
found
say
this
that.
like stereotypical, like some sort of a kung fu movie, like a parody kung fu movie, not even a real kung fu movie. It's like against the Great Wall of Steel. You know, you know, but also the guy who's saying this, right? The Aspie guy, I don't have his name in front of me. He admitted on Twitter after that, well, the translation isn't really like that. I mean, well, it might be, but it's disputed. And so I've got a list here of somebody else. And Carl, I don't know if you took a closer look at this, but I'll read what this person translated it as, because afterwards they got really angry and they speak Chinese. They're like, okay, so here's the full quote and its full context. As a nation, we have a strong sense of pride and confidence. We have never bullied, oppressed, or subjugated the people of any other country, and we never will. By the same token, we will never allow a foreign force to bully, oppress, or subjugate us. Anyone who would attempt to do so will find themselves on a collision course with a great wall of steel forged by over 1.4 billion Chinese people. That is very, very different than saying, we're going to come after you and we're going to bash your heads against steel. I don't know if you took a closer look at that, Carl, or if you have
Yes, I read it. I heard it in the original Chinese. So the Xi Jinping used a Chinese idiom, which is 撞得头破血流. But exactly, the premise is if anyone seek to bully China, they will find themselves, hitting their wall, hitting their head bloody on the wall. I mean, it's almost the same expression as the English idiom, hitting your head on the wall. Why would you do that? Why would you hit your head on the wall, right? I mean, like, why would you want to? Why would you be upset that you are not allowed to bully China? I mean, that is a very important premise there. It's just a Chinese expression that so to describe some futile effort as hitting your head bloody on the wall. Why? Because that's a stupid thing to do. Why do you do that such a thing, right?
That guy, so he afterwards, like there were a lot of people really angry with him and they confronted him on Twitter and they said, are you going to retract this? And he said, no, absolutely not. But then he admitted that there is a dispute about exactly how to translate it. And so I did a little mini thread on it. I'm like, I wonder why this guy abandoned his nuance when he was in front of a national audience. Is it because his sponsors for Aspie benefit from this kind of fear mongering, and he just went all out on this threat inflation angle? I mean, it was totally irresponsible, and this really highlights the dishonesty of this entire piece right here. I don't know if you had anything to add, Brian, before we continue.
Well, it would be like Chinese news hearing Joe Biden say something like, we're going to kill two birds with one stone, and then accuse him of animal abuse. It's an idiom. And they're doing that, but this is, I showed you how these are all the same policymakers and propagandists that were involved in the war on terror. And that's exactly what they did with the Quran. They would cherry pick a verse out of it, no context. They wouldn't tell you the sentence before or after, and they would just show you this poorly translated, cherry picked verse. And people would say, oh my God, they're talking about killing all the infidels. And this is what they're doing again. They're doing this with speeches, with things that are said and done. This is all they do. This is all they know how to do. And I will say it now and probably again and again. They have not told us the truth about anything. They have lied us into war after war after war. This is not the first time they're telling us the truth. This is not the first time they're being honest about this.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're very connected with that concept as well, because I remember you saying that when you were kind of suspicious about the Islamophobia kind of propaganda, you decided to just pick up the Quran and read it yourself. And you were like, holy crap, they really are misrepresenting this.
Actually, it was before I was waking up. I thought Muslims were the enemy. So I was like, I should read the Quran so I know what they're thinking. So that we could,
yeah.
And then when I was reading, it's like, oh my God, we are totally being lied to. This is not even close. I was like a lot of this is like really good stuff in here, and it's about peace and forgiveness and You defend yourself, but even your worst enemy, if they ask for forgiveness, you have to forgive them. Things like that. And I was like, this is not what we're being told. This is all, and they're doing it again. And they know the average American or Australian or British, they're not going to sit there and like translate it and look up Chinese idioms. They know that. They know they'll get away with this.
Yeah. So you actually went in expecting to have your ideas reinforced, and then you were given. Right. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to continue from here. Am I still coming through clear? I just got to keep checking my connection once in a while. Okay, good.
The Chinese Communist Party claims Taiwan is historically part of China, which, strictly speaking, isn't true.
Did you have anything to say about that, Carl?
Sure. I mean, historically, from when? What's the historical date they're giving here? If they go back to 10,000 years, sure. Yeah. I mean, you are right. 10,000 years, the country of China doesn't even exist. But this is just a very broad statement. Historical isn't true. They give no details. Again, like all their claims, they just make a very bold claim with nothing to back it up.
Would you be comfortable in saying that whatever interpretation anybody takes, Taiwan's history with China would go back before European settlers arrived in Australia?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I mean, definitely.
I think we need to resolve. Yeah, I think we need to resolve that first, right?
The thing that the whole talk is what all these settler colonial society does, Australia, US, that's perfectly normal. It's normal for US to have a military presence in East Asia, thousands of miles away from US mainland. But it's not normal for China to have military presence in South China Sea, right? This is kind of their framing here. It's very dishonest.
Why does China need Taiwan so badly?
Taiwan is the veritable unsinkable aircraft carrier from which China can project military power deep out into the Central Pacific.
I got to pause that again at 1334 because there it is again, like project power deep into the Pacific. Again, people, 100 miles off of the coast of China, of China mainland, and then to the other side of Taiwan, another 100 miles max. I mean,
what he's doing is he's projecting. The U.S. wants that as a way of projecting power over mainland China. That's what this is all about. It's what it's always been about. And they're saying they're going to use Taiwan to project power into what, like out into the open water. There's nothing there. What are they doing that they can't already do from the mainland? The U.S. wants Taiwan to project power into China. That's what they were trying to do with Hong Kong. That was what the riots and funding the opposition, that's what all of that was. They're doing the same thing all throughout Southeast Asia. And this is them projecting this imperialist intent back onto China. It's what this whole thing is all about.
And, it's if you go look up Taiwan unsinkable aircraft carrier, you will find it attributed to some U.S. national security establishment guy. I guarantee you. And they will mean talking about Taiwan as an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the United States against China. Right? Just people can just go ahead and Google it. You'll find it. There's nothing about China using Taiwan as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Again, it's all projection. And I just want to go back a little bit earlier. They talk about, the Taiwan's history. Taiwan has the indigenous population going back 1,000 years. What they don't tell you is that indigenous population today consists of 2% of Taiwan's total population. And what about the 98% of the Taiwan population? Yes, they came over to Taiwan when Taiwan was part of China. And so that goes back all the way to the end of Ming Dynasty. And we're talking about 1660s, 1680s here. So way before the establishment of the United States. Okay, I'm done.
I mean, they've definitely got to dumb this down and make it as simple as possible. And as Brian said, leave out a lot of context. I mean, obviously you can't include everything, but the key pieces.
It's not even leaving out context. This is deliberately misleading information. This is active disinfo.
Right.
Yes.
Did you?
Absolutely.
I see you. I see you working on your screen share. Did you have something to share, Brian, before we start?
Yeah, because I'm shocked by how many people do not know this. The U.S. does not have an embassy in Taiwan. They have an American Institute in Taiwan. This website even has the Taiwan Relations Act, and they talk about the One China policy and how there's only one China, and it's very obvious who the legitimate government is of one China. But Daniel, just as you were saying, as you said actually several times, the status quo is I think in Beijing the status quo is something they want to maintain, because if you just look at trade between Taiwan and everywhere else, their main trade partner, imports and exports, is China, is mainland China. More is being exported to mainland China than all of these regions combined. And they know that the status quo as it is, there will be reintegration, it'll be peaceful, it'll be economic, and there will be no need for invasion. The invasion would only be something possible if there was some serious provocation, if they had the government in Taiwan right now, backed by the US, declare independence. And they will never mention that. They never mention that in this entire thing, how provocative that would be, how that would be deliberately provoking China, not China just deciding one day, hey, today's a good day, let's invade Taiwan. Today's the day, let's do it. They're not going to do that.
May I share my screen for a second? And so guess what comes up? United States has de facto maintained status quo through Taiwan. On the second, and then you actually have the actual quote on the second link. When U.S. General Douglas MacArthur referred to Taiwan
priceless.
as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, right? I mean, like, this is literally U.S. General referring Taiwan as U.S. asset, unsinkable aircraft carrier. So again, this is total projection onto China.
That is priceless. That is a good find.
Yeah, no, it's really remarkable. I literally, just as we were doing this video, I just got 2 more messages on my WeChat from friends saying, you've got to check out this 60 minutes video that we're in the middle of reviewing right now. So let's continue from where we left off, and let's go.
Those who warn of China's intentions for Taiwan point to the example of Hong Kong, which is now as good as taken over by the Chinese Communist Party after crushing pro-democracy demonstrations.
Well, okay, so 1431, what does that mean? It's as good as taken over. I mean,
it belongs to China. It belongs to China. It was seized by force and squatted on by British imperialists, and then it was handed back over through conditions agreed on under duress. Like, again, like someone breaks into your house and they say, I'm only going to leave if you sign this paper. And as soon as they're out the door, you call the police and you throw the paper into a fire. You're not going to honor any of that. And yet China has tried to. And then the US and the British instigated. I mean, like, they're showing you riots in the street. They're showing you the opposite. They cannot find any footage of them not burning the city to the ground. And they're trying to say, oh, look at what China did, instead of what did you instigate, and what is the backstory of all this? Carl, it looks like you go ahead.
Yeah, and I think this is just playing on plain ignorance of the Western audience here. I mean, I'm personally surprised and shocked to find out many people didn't know Hong Kong sovereignty actually reverted back to China.
Did Carl cut out for you?
Hong Kong sovereignty actually reverted back to China.
Can you still hear Carl or no?
Yes, I can hear him.
Back
I
in
can hear him. Okay, yeah, sorry.
Back in 1997. That's when Britain formally handed over Hong Kong back to China. That was 1997. So Hong Kong has been part of China, again since 1997. So whatever China does in Hong Kong, it's China's internal business, because Hong Kong is China. This is just playing on the ignorance of their listeners, of their viewers. This is totally ridiculous.
It's a lie on top of a lie. So they're making all these lies up about Taiwan, the South China Sea, and then they're throwing Hong Kong in there. And they were trying to do to Hong Kong what they're doing in Taiwan, what they're doing in Southeast Asia. They had opposition in there that the U.S. government was funding. This is something that the U.S. government would never tolerate another nation doing to them regarding their internal political affairs. They were doing this to Hong Kong, and China uprooted that. It was foreign interference. It wasn't pro. They always talk about pro-democracy as if there could be an election, and there's two. Looks like we lost Daniel, so he probably rejoin.
Yeah, I mean, like Hong Kong was the battlefront. It was a front line of Cold War. Hong Kong was literally crawling with spooks for many decades. I mean, like those spooks didn't go away even after the Cold War ended, or even after Hong Kong was handed over to Chinese sovereignty in 1997. And what we have seen in the past since 2019 is US have decided to activate all their assets in Hong Kong, and they, through the National Endowment of Democracy, and they have tried to create trouble in Hong Kong. And again, whatever China is doing in Hong Kong, that is part of China.
Yeah, no, sorry, no, I'm back. So go ahead before we start playing the clip again. I'm trying to find the same spot, but go ahead. Yeah,
Hong Kong is a small microcosm of what's going on in Taiwan. It's just everything on a much bigger scale. The U.S. wants to maintain that as a foothold within Chinese territory. That's what Hong Kong was. That's what they were trying to do with Tibet. That's what they're trying to do with these separatists that they back in Xinjiang. This is all they do everywhere. And they will never talk about that. And if you do show them like the NED's official website and all these programs and groups that they were funding, they'll skip past that and could you just imagine if China was doing that to the US or to these other nations, then they might actually have something to put into their documentary.
Right. I think one important thing to note also is that what you said is correct. I mean, this is part. I mean, 1997 is when China took over, but actually, you should say took it back finally after they were, forcefully gave it away because they didn't accept opium being sold in the streets of their country. But even with that said, these protests successfully managed to stop the extradition bill from going through at an incredible cost. They now have this murderer free in the streets. But the only thing now is because of all the interference that was clearly going on during these protests, just as you said, Brian, the national security law is now introduced, which is something that was always supposed to be introduced from the beginning. That's part of the contract as well. I mean, every society has, developed society has a national security bill of some sort or mechanism. So I think that's really important to note as well. I tried to find the spot that we left off at. I have it at 1432. We might repeat a little bit of it, but let's give it a try.
Madame Liu proposes establishing what she calls a democratic commonwealth, comprising Taiwan, South Korea and Japan to balance China's power.
We can make a golden triangle in the region, and we also welcome Australia from the south, America, Canada from the other side of the Pacific. We all the peace-loving democracies.
All right, all right.
Look. She wants Taiwan to join this golden triangle of democracy. Japan and South Korea host tens of thousands of U.S. troops, and if Taiwan were to enter into this triangle, that's exactly what the U.S. would try to do to Taiwan. China knows it. That's the only reason why it would ever think about using military force, is because they do not want the military having an unsinkable aircraft carrier right off their coast. It's so obvious what they've been trying to do for decades. It's so obvious, and they just throw it right out there, and people just lap it up. They have no idea what they're even listening to.
And that's not even to say. That's not even to say. I think she forgot to ask the government of South Korea whether they wanted to join this iron triangle. I mean, like this, she literally just made up this thing in her head about this democratic triangle of South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. Like this is something that nobody is even talking about, except this is the first. In fact, this is the first time I heard this. It was on this show, on this program, and there's nobody in South Korea, for example, that as far as I know, is talking about forming a triangle with Taiwan. And
Japan.
And this is a fantasy, and this is fantasy being sold as a fact on this show.
I mean,
and I think
don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just real quick. I think someone was feeding her this from Washington when they were handling her back in the day, and this is just something that slips out because a lot of them do this. A lot of them had these things that they were told were going to happen, and they like when they're old, they like ramble on about it. You know, like recalling the good old days when they used to talk about the golden democracy triangle. And she just lets it slip out, and no one really is like, yeah, whatever. Sounds good. Well, that actually, maybe we'll dust that off and do it. It sounds good.
I mean, that's like the rantings of somebody completely crazy that they found to put on here, and it's just like this is something we've never heard of before. It's something that sounds ridiculous. It's something that sounds very provocative towards, China, this balance of power, which would inevitably involve the U.S. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. But we'll continue on from that point. That point was the 15-minute and 25-second mark.
There's over 1 million Uyghurs behind essentially barbed wire, just for being Uyghurs.
All right. Sorry, I'm going to continue this on a bit. All right, so 1613, this is when you have a group of people who were probably previously Islamophobes all of a sudden caring about Muslims and pumping this story out that is backed by absolutely nothing other than some of these testimonies, especially the sexual abuse one, which is coming from Tursane Ziawadan, who changed her story 3 times, who apparently had her passport renewed while she was under arrest, who left China legally through exit immigration after she escaped a concentration camp. I mean, none of this makes any sense. But I think what's perhaps more fabulous is talking about the loss of life and human rights and all this stuff and the possibility of China invading these other places when we're still dealing with these trials and with this reconciliation of what Australian soldiers did in Afghanistan, literally slitting the throats of children. We have footage of Australian SAS fighters jumping out of a helicopter and shooting Afghans face down in their field while they're holding their prayer beads. And now they're going to talk about China might eventually do the kinds of things that our country is doing, and we can't stand for that, because that's the point when we'll fall off of our moral high horse. We didn't fall off of our moral high horse when we were shooting Muslims through the back of the head. I mean, I can't. I'm sorry if I seem a little bit worked up with this one. This was one of the most absurd parts for me. I don't know if you guys have anything to add.
I will add that Australia has participated in the worst crimes against humanity of the 21st century alongside the US, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya. I got to check on Yemen to see if they were feeding weapons and support into that.
And Vietnam, don't forget about Vietnam. They have participated in every American war, even back to Korean War, Australian was there too.
That's true. So last century and this century, and as a matter of fact, they do mention that in this documentary later on. And another thing that they will do is they will compare what they think China will do to the shock and awe the U.S. used in Iraq in 2003. They'll also talk about, if you take over Taiwan, but can you hold on to it? Because look at what we did in Afghanistan for 20 years. So they're imagining all of these things that China might do, and the only way they can get you to imagine what it'll be like is if they compare it to the crimes against humanity that they themselves have participated in. They're talking about 1 million Uyghurs locked up in camps in Xinjiang, which is a lie. It's a made-up lie. They're saying there's evidence. There's evidence of allegations, which is not the same as actual evidence. They killed 1 million people in Iraq. They killed 1 million people in Iraq. They didn't lock them up.
I mean, that's even if we're going to take their story for face value, that's right. And so I don't know what kind of a high horse they've been sitting on up until now. I mean, it must be made out of some sort of vibranium metal, like whatever Captain America's shield is made out of. But that horse isn't falling over anytime soon. If you haven't already fallen off of your high horse by now, I mean, this is absolutely unbelievable. We'll continue from the 16-minute and 13-second mark.
What are they doing? Are they preparing for a fight, or is this a deterrent?
Well, you first have to ask, who would it deter? Have you ever heard anybody say that they wanted to attack China? It's really...
They have attacked China. They have. They have attacked China in so many ways.
Yes. 17 minutes and 36 seconds we're at. Yeah. I mean, like, what is this? What is this going on? I mean, like we said, releasing rebels into Tibet, the clandestine operations in Fujian province, the 2016 RAND report, which was sponsored by the State Department, talking about going to war with China and trying to isolate most of the casualties over in this region. I mean,
you literally have the General Milley calling his Chinese counterpart promise U.S. is not going to launch a surprise nuclear attack. I mean, this is from the highest military officer in United States telling China, okay, don't worry, we're not going to launch a surprise nuclear attack on you. To deter, I mean, for somebody who served as Marine intelligence to say that, this is either incredibly stupid or just incredibly facetious to make that statement.
Well, when you had people reaching out on the sidelines to China and trying to tell them, okay, listen, come on, just come, I just want you to know we're not very serious about this. It goes to show that the conversation on the surface, this political theater on the surface, absolutely is a very instigative kind of a language, which could be misinterpreted, or rather correctly interpreted, as very aggressive talk towards China. So much so that you had that general that had to step to the side and make a private call to China and say, don't worry, we're not really going to go to war with you. Don't really pay attention to this rhetoric on the surface. I mean, that's what that's about. I see you playing around with this screen share. Do you have something to share, Brian?
Yes, I just want to show this from Defense News. Here's the U.S. Marine Corps' plan for sinking Chinese ships with drone missile launchers. The U.S. Marine Corps completely scrapped all of their main battle tanks, and now their mission is custom tailored to the Indo-Pacific region and sinking Chinese ships and blocking these straits. This is what the entire Marine Corps has been reconfigured to do. This is not something you do normally with your military. Reconfigure an entire branch, custom tailor it specifically to fight one country in the world in a very specific theater and to do a very specific thing. This is what the U.S. has done. So they say actions speak louder than words. Maybe no one has directly said that they're going to attack China, although I don't think that that's true. But they have those papers that we've talked about so many times, and they're doing things like this, which is the same as saying, we're going to attack China. We're going to stop your shipping through these straits, and we're going to crush your economy because we're not going to allow you to surpass us. And they've said it so many times from the 1960s to the 1990s, all the way up to today. They are not going to accept China surpassing them. When all things being equal, they will surpass the U.S.
So when this guy uses this language in this special saying that we're not saying this kind of stuff, no, you absolutely are. Sorry, Carl, go ahead.
And not to mention, U.S. and especially U.S. Marine had a history of occupying China. U.S. Marines in particular had been posted in China since the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, all the way up to 1941. When the Pacific War broke out. And then immediately after the end of World War II, U.S. sending 60,000 military personnel to China in Operation Beleaguered, out of which 50,000 Marines landed in northern China in end of 1945 and 1946. U.S. Marine has a history of attacking, occupying China. You can't say the same about China and the mainland US. That's why all they can talk about is hypotheticals here.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. This is the RAND document. Yeah, you've got up 2016, was it, Brian?
Yes, 2016.
2016, a State Department funded document that talks about basically having a war with China. And that point that you brought up about drone strikes against and sinking Chinese ships, that point is going to be reiterated in this documentary. I remember that. And we're going to get to that in a sec. So let's continue playing that.
President Xi Jinping has been cracking down hard on his own people to bring them into line with Communist Party thinking.
Can we pause it?
Sure, we're pausing here the 20 minutes and 14 seconds.
Because they're going to go into the crackdown on the Chinese people. But before that, they're talking about, will the U.S. Help Taiwan? The U.S. doesn't care about Taiwan. It couldn't care less if it tried. This whole notion of independence is entirely artificial. It's divorced from the socioeconomic aspects of Taiwan's relationship to the mainland. You could just look at the economic data. It's so obvious. They're going to use Taiwan as an excuse to shut down China's shipping lanes. And that's all they're going to do. They don't care what happens to Taiwan. If they could somehow establish a foothold there militarily, they would love to do that. But look at what they did to Afghanistan and all of their so-called, they say we need to look out for our friends. Look at all their friends in Afghanistan, how that all ended up. And look at Taiwan itself. The U.S. was backing them in the beginning. And then in the 1970s, they kind of ditched them. And then when this kind of bait and switch that they tried to trap Beijing in didn't work, they went right back to supporting Taiwan again. So Taiwan is like this. It's like in an abusive relationship, and it just keeps ignoring the fact that every time it the coat hanger comes, and then they forgive them and try to forget it. But the coat hanger is always going to come out because that's what the U.S. is. It's abusive, it's invasive, and just think about it. It's on the other side of the ocean doing this. People have to keep that in mind.
I think a lot of people who may be able to empathize with that point. There are some people who will empathize with that point, but they don't take it one step further and don't realize that Australia is actually no different as well. As soon as Australia outlives its usefulness for the U.S., it doesn't actually really matter that you're also Caucasian. I think maybe that's what they're hoping on. They're like, we look the same. You're going to stand up for us. I mean, yeah, sure, maybe we might use and abuse Taiwan, but I don't think anybody's immune to this. If really they saw no future benefit or whatever, things played itself out where they said, okay, we're just abandoning this strategy in the South Pacific, in the Asia Pacific region. No, there's no, like what you were talking about with France. There's no loyalty amongst thieves, right? And they've shown this over and over again with allies as well. They spy on their own allies. They lock up the executives of the allied countries' companies like Alstom, and then it forced them to sell to GE and all of this kind of stuff. This is something that people definitely need to keep in mind. So we got to the 2014. We'll continue from there.
Xi calls it rectification, and he's banned everything from boy bands and reality TV shows to foreign computer games and apps. China's private schools have been all but decimated by new regulations, and lessons.
Okay, I got to pause that there for a second.
They just added to the boy band's reality TV shows. I like to know which reality TV show that just got banned, in addition to the boy bands. Listeners, please send in anything you know about this information.
Right,
I would like to know.
The private schools my kids go to a private international school. Like, none of this stuff is happening. Like, nothing has changed. I mean, the most nationalistic thing they do is they every Monday they have a flag raising ceremony. They raise the Chinese flag, and along behind it, they've got flags from every country, which there are people in the school from. They've got the Indian flag, they've got the Canadian flag, they've got the American flag. They've got it all there flying behind it. But they do a flag raising ceremony for the Chinese flag. But I seem to recall in elementary school in Canada, every single morning we had to stand for the national anthem. It wasn't just on Monday. So, yeah, I don't know. I
In
don't know what's
US,
going on.
we have to do a pledge allegiance every day.
Every day.
Every day.
Every single
Every
day,
day.
without fail. And you got to stand up and you got to put your hand over your heart.
Yep. One country, indivisible, under God. You have to say under God, even if you don't believe in God.
And
Only
you know,
once per week in China here. My kids, once per week on Monday, flag raising. That's it. Done.
And look, if a country wants to instill patriotism in their people, it's like it's their country, it's their schools. Let them do it the way they want to do it. I don't understand why the West thinks that they get to compare everybody else's system to theirs, and if it doesn't match, they're somehow wrong instead of just doing it differently. And in a lot of ways, it's really not that different. And it's just this supremacy attitude that the West has, where only their way is acceptable, everything else is inferior, and this is rooted all the way back to the history of Western imperialism, and it just rears its ugly head everywhere you look. It's popping out in this documentary.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. It is, and then when you have institutions from the U.S. like the Harvard University's Ash Institute doing these studies, saying that over 90% of Chinese people in their independent studies support their government, and then York University out of Canada did a follow-up study which put it even higher. It's like, what do you care? I mean, if people in China are happy, what is this? That's even more the reason. It's already none of their business, but when you add that on top, it's even more absurd that they're saying, oh my God, look what they're doing. I mean, it is ridiculous. But so we're at the 2031 mark, and we'll continue from there.
On what's called Xi Jinping thought are now compulsory in primary schools. It's as if it's a population being readied for trouble.
Wait, hold on a second, real quick. A population being readied for trouble, and they're saying that because China is going to provoke this war, so they're getting their population ready. And what they're leaving out is 100 years of humiliation. Carl mentioned the Boxer Rebellion, the separatism that the U.S. has been funding and arming in Tibet and Xinjiang, the violent riots in Hong Kong, and let's just look at the list, an ever-growing list of nations around the globe that the U.S. has destroyed, and exactly, with the same lead up, the same sort of propaganda, the same sort of interference and encroachment. Of course, they're getting ready for some sort of disruption in their society. The U.S. has all but declared war on them, and in a way, for decades, they have been fighting what would you call it? Kind of an unconventional, asymmetrical war against China. All of this time, they've been doing it. So yes, a country needs to regiment itself when it's under attack. It's common sense. The U.S. would do it yeah.
And I have to add, it's almost this whole narrative, whole framing is that China is up to no good. That it's almost take granted, China is going to attack Taiwan anytime soon. I'm not aware of any kind of Chinese TV show where they had a host a so-called debate on a coming war with US or Australia or even Taiwan. This TV show aimed to do is exactly preparing the Australians citizens to be ready for war that they plan to have soon with China. I don't see the same thing happening in China right now. I see all this fear mongering happening in US, in Australia, and all these Western societies.
That's exactly what I wanted to mention, because that is the ultimate irony. While they are saying that in this special, that they are preparing their people for war, that's literally what this special is doing for Australian people, preparing them for the idea that there may be an inevitable conflict coming. I mean, they're doing the exact same thing that they're saying that China's doing, and I don't see any evidence of that here. I don't see any evidence of people preparing themselves for war. And on the contrary, when you hear people who are in the PLA or who want to join the PLA, I met this guy here. He works for this indoor snowboarding place. They've got these like moving mats and stuff like that. It's really cool. And I got talking to this guy, and we had a connection because he went to university in Buffalo, New York. And it was really cool because we knew all the same places, because I used to drive down to Buffalo. It doesn't take too long from Toronto. And we used to go to the same place, Buzzy's, this famous place for wings and pizza. And so we had this connection. We were talking about it, and I got to know him a little bit. And he was talking about he really, really wanted to join the PLA, and he couldn't. He wasn't eligible because he spent too much time outside of China. I think the requirements.
Your signal kind of went out, and then it like rushed to catch up.
Okay, what point did I get to? What did you hear up until?
You were saying that he couldn't join because he spent too much time outside of China.
Right. So and so I got talking to him to find out a little bit more about, well, why was it you wanted to join and to begin with, and just find out a little bit more about the mindset that goes in. And the interesting takeaway that I had was that when somebody in America or Canada joins the military, and you say that you want to join the military to defend your country, you almost immediately know that that's going to involve you being deployed somewhere else, in someone else's country, on the other side of the planet, which already should, get your spidey senses going and make you think, well, hold on a second. Are we really defending our country? Let's figure out what we're actually doing. But for the PLA, people who want to join the PLA, it's people who have a deep understanding of Chinese history. They want to defend their country. They want to make sure it doesn't go through what they experienced during the century of humiliation. And it legitimately is to defend China on its own soil. And there's this completely different concept. So if you're talking about people getting ready for a battle in China, from what I've seen talking to people on the ground who are either in the PLA or want to join the PLA, it is completely a legitimate, authentic wanting to defend their country. Not this BS narrative that ends up sending you on the other side of the planet to actually, in fact, defend the corporate interests of your nation. So I think that's really important.
I just like to share my personal story. When I first came to United States at age of 13, I walked into the 8th grade classroom in the U.S. elementary school, and this was the time of the first Gulf War. So we have support our troops posters all posted all across our 8th grade classroom, and talking about patriotism. I just thought it was crazy. Like, how is it patriotic to go to Iraq, to go to Middle East and fight Iraq? I mean, this is a war between Iraq and Kuwait. It has nothing to do with U.S. Why is it patriotic for U.S. citizens to go fight in Iraq? I mean, at that time, I just didn't get it. I was 13 years old. I just thought this is kind of a little bit too over the top, for all these kind of military posters with tanks and everything in an 8th grade classroom. But I guess when you live in that kind of propagandized environment long enough, you become desensitized. You're not even aware of the fact that you are being propagandized too. I mean, this is what your talk made me think about. Anyway, enough of my rant.
I mean, that is remarkable. I mean, you have these images. You always talk about, so these military parades in China, and these, some people, they still have Mao's picture on their wall that they keep on their wall and stuff like that. This over the top display of patriotism, but when you're talking about this 8th grade, when you're being propagandized at that age, and you're going into class and you're seeing all of these, glorifying your military that's going and fighting, like you said, in a battle that's got nothing to do with yourselves. It is really, really bizarre. And I think people need to put that into perspective. I mean, you have a lot of people from Hong Kong, who are the minority radicalized group, talking about that as well. About, look, there's a poster of Mao Zedong in this restaurant or something like that. And it's like, before the handover, there was a picture of the Queen on every government building. It's like when you walk into government buildings in Hong Kong, there was the portrait of the queen, and that has nothing to do with you. That she doesn't even look like you. What's going on, Brian? Did you want to add?
Yeah, I want to kind of add to Carl's story because I was in America. I remember that time. I think I was a little younger, but they had this Scholastic Weekly or some kind of thing that they would give out to every school. And they would always have like the troops, like they got the American flag and they're in the desert. And I was like basting in that war propaganda from the cradle. And so I totally bought into it. You know how crazy it was. I mean, people will say, oh, look, they got a picture of Mao, or in Thailand, they have pictures of the king everywhere. And they're like, oh, that's so weird. We had baseball cards for Desert Storm trading cards, not just one company. There were multiple companies that did this. And you'd have like people would be like trading them like, I want a Schwarzkopf. Do you got a Schwarzkopf? I'll give you, 2 Colin Powells and a Dick Cheney for a Schwarzkopf. It's completely insane. Like me and my older brother talk about this stuff all the time. And we like reminisce on how completely insane. Carl, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah,
It's
I know
so
exactly.
crazy.
You're bringing back memories.
I had no
That's
idea.
why I'm cracking up.
Look it up. People don't believe me. Look
This,
up.
I had no idea this existed.
Hold on.
It's true. It's
get
true.
it. Desert,
Oh my
desert,
God, that is.
Desert
I'm
Storm
literally holding back my.
Oh,
Hold on. Here, can I share my screen here?
Yes. Oh, that can't be.
Oh
that,
man,
come
Ray,
on.
it is. I had them. I collected them all. I had them all. I had them all.
Oh my
and I put them in the dividers. The card dividers. I had like different binders. Because at the time you totally buy into it, and like my whole family, we kind of look back on that as we can laugh, but it's also kind of sad because we all got duped into it. And when you think about it, how they prey on, like, this is diabolical, getting kids into this. Like, think about the highway of death, for example, and then the sanctions and everything else. So like when you really, it's funny, but then on the other hand, it's so sad. If you don't laugh, you're going to cry because it's how they prey on Americans and kids. You want to talk about parades, the homecoming parades for the troops. We would go out there and we would wait for them to parade by. I would get them to we had a poster and they would sign their name and like they were almost like superstars. And this was all contributing factors to me eventually joining the Marine Corps. That's why because I was patriotic. And then, thank God I woke up and I didn't do anything I would regret for the rest of my life. But look at this. This is Dick Cheney. Oh my God!
I remember I went to my freshman year. I went to Kingwood Academy, which is a high school in Chicago South Side. My high school was I think 93% black, and I remember the Army recruiters will come regularly. I don't know if it's because they specifically target disadvantaged groups. But I did remember the military recruiters come regularly to our schools, talk to the kids, about, hey, you futures in the military, this for ways to get out of the ghetto. This is how you become a productive citizen. Join the military.
And how are you going to pay for college?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah. No, I was laughing at you guys, but I suddenly remembered something from my childhood that should be even more embarrassing than that, because I'm a lot younger than I look. Like I mean, Carl looks younger than me, but I'm not even in my 40s yet. I'm almost there, but I just look really old. But I remember when I was really, really young, and I learned something about Colin Powell somewhere. And I was kind of really proud. Like, I was like, this is a person of color who, achieved a position of power, this military commander or whatever he was at the time. I can't remember, but I was really, really young. And I grew up in an all-white town, so there wasn't much diversity there. So that was something that was very interesting for me as a visible minority. And I remember there was a show where they were selling these different coins with, different military leaders and stuff like that. And I suddenly remember, I don't know why I only remember this now. I forgot it completely up until this point. And I asked them if they had any coins with Colin Powell on it. And the guy just said, he was very nice to me, but he says, no, usually you have to wait until they're dead before they make coins of people like this. And I felt like an idiot. I was like, oh yeah, of course. But I was like totally buying into this thing, and I wanted a coin with Colin Powell on it. And now I recognize him as this giant lying war criminal. But it's kind of similar to this card trading story where, you know,
he was a hero of mine too. I had because they had the weekly reader or whatever, and then they had the thing where you could order the books, and I got this kind of like a kid version biography of Colin Powell, and I read it, and like he was one of my kind of like a hero, I guess, growing up. And then, you know, when I woke up and he's got the vial, and you see what it's kind of, you know, it's one of those things that just punches a hole straight through everything you thought you believed in. But it's important. You gotta accept that.
Absolutely. And that's why when I had my first episode with you, Brian, when I was talking about it, I mean, that must be really just, it sinks your heart to realize that all of this was just completely bogus, and that you, maybe even worse, that we bought into it. But as silly as this is, man, I mean, the propaganda works really well. And there's a lot of people who still haven't escaped that, and they still believe in this crap. But it's important.
And then to just circle us back to the documentary, we still got a lot to get through. They're talking about, you know, Chinese war propaganda, blah, blah, blah. Well, we can see how psychopathic it is in the U.S. to where they got trading cards for little kids to trade people who are engineering the death of tens of thousands of people in a country on the other side of the planet. So this you know, this
and this.
Context.
Yeah, and it ties into this thing where these people grow up. These people grow up in the West being completely desensitized to any deaths other than Americans, which was exemplified in the Kabul explosion, where the only people who exist were those, you know, dozen Marines who died, and the many more times Afghans who died weren't even mentioned across most of the reports. They didn't even exist. And there's something really, really sick about that. And in this documentary, there's going to be a point which exemplifies that point also. So let's continue on it, because we're at 11:30 at night. I hope you guys are still okay for time. But
I'm okay. I'll be okay.
Okay, we'll get through this.
Came to war, how would it actually play out?
We have to be able to sink the PLA Navy, the largest Navy in the world today. We have to put it under the water, down to Davy Jones's locker. We have to sink that fleet.
I'm not going to say too much right now, but okay, you can say something in a second. So we're at the 21:02 mark. Remember this. Remember him talking about sinking the entire Chinese fleet, because it's going to be really important for a point that I want to make in a second. But Carl, first, you go ahead.
Okay, so when he said we have to sink the entire PLA fleet, the largest navy in the world, I was taken aback. I'm like, was my information all wrong? I had to go like fact check myself. I'm like, I'm pretty sure U.S. Navy is the largest navy in the world. And yes, U.S. Navy is still the largest navy in the world. You know, like I look up the James defense that do the side comparison of the PLA Navy and the U.S. Navy. You know, Chinese Navy doesn't even come close. You know, U.S. Navy has a far larger both personnel and physical assets. So I don't know what he's talking about.
I think there were some reports that were trying to twist it in a different way by tonnage or something like that. There were some reports that were saying that now the Chinese Navy is bigger, but they had to change the metrics in order to accomplish that. I don't know, Brian, if you know more about that.
Yeah, they might have like a slightly larger number of ships, but overall tonnage is still way in favor of the U.S. And then there's this other aspect. So they're always talking about how China is this huge threat. They're expansionists. They're imperialists. If you look at the Chinese Navy, for example, technically it's a blue water fleet, which means it can operate all around the world. But they do not have the infrastructure in place to support major operations all around the globe. And according to who, it depends on who you talk to, some will say that this is still kind of like, they would call it a green water fleet, where it's kind of confined to its peripheries, which you can see. Read that RAND document. they talk about how China's forces are all concentrated in China, and how any conflict would be near China because that's where all their forces are. That's where all the flashpoints the U.S. is trying to leverage to trigger a conflict. And then there's airlift. This is something else people don't think about, but you could have 1 million people in your army, but how are you going to get them to say from China to another country they want to invade or expand into? You need sea lift and airlift, and they simply don't have it. They have like 20 airlift jets that could be comparable to a C-17. The U.S. has something like 200, over 200. Just to give you an idea of how far behind China's capabilities are. They're not developing those capabilities because they don't have these ambitions. Their army and their navy and their air force is defensive. It's to defend China. It's not to project power all around the globe. It will take years to develop that capability, and everyone will see them doing it out in the open. So another thing they'll never tell you about.
I'm pulling up a infographics from Jane's defense here. The U.S. have 68 nuclear power submarines. China had 15. The U.S. have 11 aircraft carriers. China has 2. So I mean, in terms of cruisers, destroyers, U.S. all have the larger number. The only thing that China has more is smaller ships like the frigates and corvettes. Because as you say, China's is still organized around defending the Chinese territorial waters, and even looking at the personnels, right? U.S. still has far larger Navy personnel than U.S. When they talk about having greater tonnage, what does that mean? U.S. still has by far, more manpower. So this is, I mean, what they said about people, PLA Navy being the world's largest Navy is simply untrue.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't remember the measure they used to twist that. I don't know if it was tonnage or not, but yeah, absolutely. This says a lot.
It's total ships, but you could see like they're tiny. They're tiny. So when you add up the tonnage, the U.S. has fewer ships, but they're more significant, and the balance of power is still in favor of the U.S. by far.
All right, so the tonnage is still in the favor of the U.S. side. Yes. Okay, all right. Let's continue from the 2102 mark.
Director of Intelligence and Information Operations for the US Pacific Fleet, Captain James E. Fennell, has wargamed an invasion of Taiwan and says China would use a tactic learned from the US military Operation Desert Storm during the First Gulf War. The strategy called shock and awe.
I just want to pause this for a second because this actually, a 2130, this is really interesting because I've said this so many times in our episodes, Brian, where they're constantly worried that China will eventually do what the U.S. already does. And they pretty much just repeated what I said, just shy of word for word right there. I mean,
they're
really
like,
is.
Oh, maybe you can't really imagine what a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would look like. Do you remember that time we did it to Iraq in the 1990s? Or do you remember that other time we did it to them in 2003? Or Libya when we completely destroyed that country? Or how about Syria? Those cruise missiles, the shock and awe after false flag chemical weapon attacks. Do you remember all those times we did that? It will look something like that. If they do it.
Yeah. They literally agreed with what I continually say. It's like they're worried that China will eventually do what the West already does today, which is also an admission that what they do is pretty problematic, but that's obviously not something that they want to focus on. We'll continue from the 2130 mark here.
They left out lightsaber. I think they're also developing lightsabers.
One of the systems they're developing is the DF-26, which is an intermediate range ballistic missile that can strike at US carriers as far out as Guam. If they can sink aircraft carriers, that's a huge loss of life. Each aircraft carrier has about 5,000 personnel on board.
I got to pause that here. This is where I wanted to make my point at the 2312 mark. Do you remember they were talking about that they had one guy on saying they wanted to sink the entire PLA fleet? And it was just like very nonchalantly talking about it. There was no consideration of the life that would have been lost during those operations. They don't care about that. But suddenly, when he's talking about in a battle when American ships with military personnel are sunk, now we've got to consider the loss of life. And this is the most obvious black and white example of what I said. Foreign, non-white or whatever it is, non-Western lives, they don't matter. They don't give a shit about them. When they were talking about sinking the entire PLA fleet, nobody talked about the loss of life. But now, when they say maybe China will retaliate, maybe China will hit some of our aircraft carriers, and can you imagine how many Americans would die? All of a sudden, that becomes a relevant part of the conversation. I don't know if you guys picked up on that, but that's really infuriating, and it also is very telling.
It's the foundation of Western war propaganda and this is, when we were talking about Winston Sterzel and the racism, this is part of dehumanizing the enemy. You cannot convince an entire population to go to war with someone they see as human, as equal. So this is part of the dehumanization that they need to do. They did it. I mean, I remember when I was a kid and trading those cards, the Desert Storm cards, how everyone was dehumanizing the Iraqis and making Saddam into this cartoon villain. And they're doing the exact same thing to the Chinese president, the Chinese people, the Chinese military. And did you hear him say, oh, they could hit carriers as far out as Guam? Guam, one of these islands, the U.S. took from the Spanish who had no right to be there. So this is them, again, projecting constantly. China, the expansionist, they might threaten our ships near these islands that we seized by force. It's crazy.
No, it is. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a double standard there, but I think it's really telling. Let's continue on. I think there's some more really revealing parts coming up. So 2312, we'll continue from there.
So
Off the coast, in disputed territory, China has built artificial islands loaded with defensive hardware.
I got to quickly add something here at the 23:52 minute mark. Kishore Mahbubani talks about this quite a lot, where he talks about this pact that China had with America and an agreement with Obama, talking about the fact that China wouldn't expand onto these islands as long as, America didn't continue to forcefully kind of push their way through the South China Sea with these freedom of navigation exercises or military ships coming through. And what ended up happening is when China really started ramping this up is when, even though it seemed like they had I'm not sure if it was a verbal or a physical actually signed agreement, whatever the case may be, when those missions continued, China realized, okay, well, we need to have a defensive kind of perimeter around us here, and that's where they continued. I don't know if you guys looked into that anymore. Kishore is the one who talks about that the most from what I've seen.
As far as I know, they've been doing those freedom of navigation exercises for years, decades even. And I mean, if you were in charge of defending China, you would have to do this, because no matter what agreement the U.S. might make from administration to administration, since the 1960s, and I've shown the U.S. State Department's own Office of Historian their documents talking about encircling and containing China. If they do not do this, they're in an even more vulnerable position for this war that the U.S. has clearly been engineering and incrementally putting the pieces on the game board to wage against China. They would be crazy not to. And again, we're talking about the South China Sea. There's all these overlapping claims. There's other countries that have built structures, and not as impressive as China because they don't have the resources to do it, but they've done similar things. And so again, this is them cherry picking and just showing you one side of the story because they're afraid if they show you the other side, your perception will change. It's propaganda.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember when Kishore talked about it. It was agreement that China will not station missiles on those islands if the U.S. back off from the freedom of navigation patrols. But U.S. didn't hold up its own end of the bargain, so China went ahead and put missiles on those artificial islands. And another thing about those artificial islands is not they were already the reefs that China already control, just like the other South China Sea claimants have their own reefs that they control and they build on top of that. So it's not something that China is uniquely doing. It's just that China just happened to have more resources, so their artificial island is bigger, has longer airstrips.
Right. Yeah. All right, let's continue. 2352.
Just imagine if a country on the other side of the world said that to Australia, that we want to prevent you from being able to control militarily the territory off your coast. I think we in Australia would regard that as a hostile posture.
I want to pause that for a second. That's really good balance that's added in. There's not enough balance like that, but it's a very good question, and they don't explore it enough. They don't go into it deep enough. But I almost feel a little bit sorry for that guy, because I know the environment in Australia. Something malfunctioned on your side, Carl.
It's my ring light.
Okay, it didn't sound like it was having a good time there. But anyways, I'll continue while you're sorting that out. So they didn't explore this deep enough, and what I was saying, yeah, I feel kind of sorry for him, because I know the environment in Australia. There's a lot of people in Australia who want to speak up. They want to be a little bit more forceful when they're fighting back against this kind of propaganda, but they realize that it's a very, very dangerous environment to do so. If they push back too hard, they're going to be called a CCP shill or an agent or a Communist Party spy. There was this academic, Jane Gawley. She wanted to push back against the Xinjiang genocide narrative, and she got completely roasted. There was no room for her to have this discussion, and she ended up taking I think it was like a 5-month stress leave. She had to take a 5-month stress leave, and then finally she resigned from her position. There's just no room. There's no room for that. So I wonder if this guy, he was actually, because he sounds very, very reasonable, I wonder if he wanted to push back even more than that, but he just had to be very, very measured and careful about it. He definitely planted the seeds there. They could have explored that more, but they didn't. I mean, even the guy who was nodding his head while he was saying that, he was like, yeah, whatever. Yeah, I mean, you got a point, but whatever. Can we move on to fear mongering again? I mean, that's the impression I got. But we will continue here from the 2440.
I want Xi Jinping and the next person and the next person to always wonder, hey, is there a nuclear missile coming down on my head right now? I want them to think that. That doesn't mean I want to do it, but I want to be able to rationally let them know we have that capability, and if we get pressed too much, you think you're the angry guy with the axe? You have not seen anything yet.
Is this when you come?
So 26.
He loves the angry guy with the axe. He loves that. I don't know what his obsession with the angry guy with the axe, but he loves to bring that up anytime he could.
I don't know. I mean, maybe it was like, the Avengers Endgame when Thor changed to an axe instead of a hammer. I don't know what's going on there, but I'm glad he at least admitted that as much as I'm theorizing that China is the angry guy with the axe, actually we're the even angrier guy with the axe. So I'm glad that he put that on the table. I'm glad he said in black and white that he hopes that the people of China continually live in fear that there could be a nuclear bomb over their head, because of course America is the only country that has ever dropped a nuclear bomb on civilian populations, and he wants the people of China to be well aware that they could do it again and it could be over them. I mean, you know what? He doesn't realize what he sounds like, a psychopathic maniac, mass murderer. But people who are paying attention enough will say, okay, all right, there's something wrong here.
And this is how they try to convince people that China is acting and talking, and yet they're the ones openly doing it while trying to make the case that it's China doing this. And they struck Japan twice with nuclear weapons. That was a first strike, and people debate it all the time again with all these false pretexts. Japan was defeated. They had no air force. They had no fleet. It's an island nation. They were not going to swim out and get America. They dropped those 2 nuclear bombs on Japan to make a statement. It was a political move. People say, well, we would have had to have invaded Japan. They were already trying to surrender. They just didn't like the conditions, and they saw an opportunity to demonstrate this weapon. This is the US. This is what they do. They're still talking about doing it. Nuclear first strike, completely unrepentant.
And that was also a gesture to the Soviets. It was they just used the opportunity to demonstrate to the Soviets that US has this awesome weapon. And that this is at this point of this show, I started to wonder why we're having all these shows talking about whether or not to get into a war with China. But why isn't nobody talking about de-escalating? What, because how do you, once you go nuclear, where do you go from there? Nobody is talking about de-escalating, or like how, like the even possible. What do you do? How do you de-escalate so it doesn't escalate into a nuclear war? Because once you go nuclear, it's game over. It's a world and civilization ending apocalypse we're talking about. But nobody is really in the room is even talking about, hey, wait a minute here. Maybe we should sit back before we talking about pushing that button. Maybe that's a really stupid thing to do. Like, we don't have to do that. Like, why we're not having that conversation?
I think that's where that other guy comes in, where I feel like the only reasonable guy is kind of deliberately holding back a little bit more. I get the sense that he wants to say more, but he's got to be careful, because there really is this McCarthyism 2.0 Red Scare kind of thing, where they're witch hunting these people who are too far against the mainstream media narrative on these kinds of issues. But yeah, maybe we'll continue on. Can you guys still hear me clearly? I had some connection issues there for a second.
Yes, now I can hear you.
Okay, good. All right. So we'll some of what I said might have been cut out, but we will continue. We're at the 26-minute mark, so we got a little bit more, and then we'll wrap this up. Let's go.
Do you see that?
No, I mean, I think it's pretty clear to the Chinese that if the Chinese strike Australian territory with WMDs, that is treated as an attack on the US. The US would retaliate with overwhelming force.
I just want to pause that for a second at 27:49. I don't necessarily disagree with him. I think he's probably correct, but the level of confidence that he has in that it's an absolute, I think, is really unfounded, given America's history with how they use, abuse, and discard allies or temporary allies whenever they need. I think that's something that Australia needs to keep in mind. So we're at 27:49. I want to back up here for just a second. So we're at 29:52 right now. But if we go back to, do you notice?
Will essentially be happening in our backyard.
They're showing.
Is this a conflict?
They're showing the strike zone of China being expanded to the U.S. after they take over Taiwan. They show the circle on Taiwan, like as if that would be the essential. That extra 100 miles would be the essential element for them to be able to get to the U.S. coast. Again, it's this manufacturing this idea and perhaps consent amongst the population, saying we need to intervene if something happens between China and Taiwan, because then it means they can reach the west coast of USA, and without like recognizing that it's only 100 miles off the coast of China.
She literally said that China in a conflict with Taiwan will be happening in our backyard. I mean, if anybody can look at a map, if anything, Taiwan is in China's backyard. It's still very, very far from Australia. I mean, in fact, Australia is on an entirely different hemisphere, on the southern hemisphere. It's not even close to Australia.
I remember that the first time I was watching that about the backyard comment. It was like, oh, wait, hold on a second.
This makes no sense. And you have to keep in mind, they just made this list of Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, but also Libya and Syria. These are all complete, these were all based on absolute lies. They were horrific crimes against humanity. There's all of this, reflection and regret about doing it, at least in some quarters of the West. And even if they're just pretending that they're sorry about it. And now there's this new war that they're trying to get everyone primed for. Is this going to be the first war? Is this the first war they're not lying to us about? Is this the first war that they actually need to fight and aren't picking a fight like they just did for, like she just said, like the last century? I mean, people need to keep that in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, so we'll continue from 2952.
Facilities here that would, in the immediate moments of any conflict situation probably spring into action. And that would unfortunately entail that Australian soil may well be used in a conflict before Australians have actually had a say in that question.
The truth is, the Australian government has little control over what occurs at these bases or what defence decisions might come from them when the US faces war. Because of the US assets on Australian soil, it's true, isn't it, that an order to fire can be made and we won't know about it.
Absolutely. We call these things the joint facilities, but the fact is, members of American Congress have more oversight and knowledge as to what goes on in these facilities than members of the Australian Parliament. We have to recognise the position that we're in. The most important question that any society can face, the question of whether or not to go to war, may well end up getting decided for us.
I think this is a really important point where they recognize this. I stopped at the 3103 mark. They're constantly talking about Chinese influence. They're talking about China being able to coerce different countries, or Australia needing to prevent Chinese coercion from affecting their society. They literally have military bases on their own in their own country that they have no control over and could literally launch a war from, while they're complaining about China potentially coercing Australian society or different places. Like, I appreciate that they admitted this, but they could have taken a really meaningful reflection away from this and perhaps even felt embarrassed about what they're trying to frame about the potential for China to influence circumstances in the region while they've got something like this on their hands. I mean, I just find it completely absurd.
And it all goes back to what Malcolm Davis had said earlier about we're not going to bend the knee. It looks like Australia already bent the knee.
Cut the knee off. And yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, again, look at the trade that Australia does with China, and then look at what it does with the United States. There's no reason for China and Australia to have like a very negative relationship. Australia and the US demonstrably have a negative relationship where this is already a reality for them, where they could be dragged into a war against their own will, and they pretty much have been. I don't know if it's in here or somewhere else where they say the Prime Minister can just tell the Minister of Defense and they just go to war, and there's no debate, and they're saying, well, yeah, this 60-minute segment, this is the debate, and you can see that it's not a debate, it's manufacturing consent, and this is Australia being dragged off to war after war after war, and these are all blemishes on their history that they have to carry into the future indefinitely.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. We'll continue from the 3103 mark.
Also of critical concern to our experts is the impact a war with China would have on nearly 1.5 million Chinese Australians. After all, during World War II, Japanese Australians, despite having lived here for more than 50 years, were rounded up and imprisoned.
Can we jump in before they get too far? Because they're talking about putting all these Uyghurs in camps, and there were these security measures, but it was because there was this campaign of actual terrorism. There were hundreds of people being killed in terrorist attacks. Australia locked these Japanese people up because they were afraid of disloyalty. Not because they actually did something, not because there was some sort of situation where things were happening and they needed to do this. This was just them, hey, we're at war with Japan. These people have Japanese background. Let's just lock them up. Let's just lock them up just to be on the safe side. Let's lock them up. And the audacity for them to turn around and wag their finger at China over this Xinjiang issue, it's just absurd because it's not even comparable. They're not even two things that you can compare. They were just interning, and they did the same thing in the U.S. also. They interned Japanese.
What's also interesting and really important too is what you'll hear in a moment in this special is that the two of them recognize that probably will happen again if there's a war with China. He even says to the other guy, he says, "I'll see you in there." And so they realize that's not beyond their society. So even taking the accusations about Xinjiang at face value, which are completely fabricated to begin with, that's a very valuable point that you brought up. There was a real actual issue of things actually happening. But these two guys, and you'll see in a moment, they recognize that they'll probably be rounded up, even though nothing of any importance happened from the Australian Chinese community at all, other than the fact that Australia is now in a war with China. And we'll get to that point in a moment. But that's a very, very valuable point to hone in onto. So we're at 34:53, and I'll continue from there.
All those sociological consequences have not been factored in, with people of ethnic Chinese descent or people who look like people of ethnic Chinese descent being abused in the streets, calls from the extreme right and the fringes for them to be placed in internment camps.
Do you fear, all of you, that Chinese Australians will be seen as the enemy within?
Absolutely. I mean, the Australian Chinese community and everybody who look vaguely sort of Chinese, in the event that, there is a war with China, what Clinton said, this notion of internment camps, is a very real prospect. John, I'll see you there.
That's what I'm talking about right there.
So and he had no comeback. John had no comeback because he knows it's true.
He knows it's true. Absolutely. He's hoping he's got some kind of get out of jail free card because he's doing the war propaganda now. But don't bank on it.
Yeah. You can see his smile there. He's like, I'm trying my hardest to please people here and be on the right side of this warmongering. But at the end of the day, and this answers a question whether Australians are truly ignorant about the brutal nature of their society and what they're capable of. Sorry, before I continue, is my connection still okay?
Yeah,
it's okay. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So they recognize, they answer a question that I always had in my mind. Do they recognize the brutality of their own society and what they're capable of based on what they continually do? And this is the answer. They say, yeah, they know. So when they're doing this virtue signaling, underneath it all, they know that there's a level of hypocrisy there. But that's a classic. I'm glad I paused on this point here. That's a classic smile there where he just knows. He's like, you can see his face is like, yeah, well,
he's hoping to get a better bunk bed at this point.
Yeah.
Exactly. All right. So at least they're aware. That's good. At least they're aware. 35-34. We'll continue from here.
No.
Do we take it for granted that America will win any kind of war, or do you accept that we may not?
The bottom line is America may not win, but they actually have to prepare their best to try and hold the line here because it's so crucial.
You know what it's
Hold the
crucial
line.
for? Well, you know what it's crucial for somebody who's working for a think tank that's funded by the military-industrial complex. It's crucial for the military-industrial complex that even if the America is ultimately going to lose, that they make some nice cash along the way, that they line their pockets along the way. So, I mean, this guy has such a vested interest in threat inflation to please his sponsors, the people who are actually paying him. There needs to be more of a warning about the kinds of conflicts of interest that's going on in this program, but it's just not.
And
so we're
ASPI,
at
ASPI that the organization he is part of literally got a finder's fee for brokering a deal where Australia purchased anti-ship missiles from United States because China threat, because Australia needed to protect its trade route with China from China, obviously, with anti-ship missiles, so they can sink those iron ore tankers, like shipping iron ore from Australia to China.
Yeah, there it is. That was one of their their cuts, their fees that they got. Here's a picture of some of their sponsors. I mean, it's like this is ridiculous. This is remarkably ridiculous.
And he says, hold the line. And what is he talking about? Hold what line? What is he talking about? Right off China's coast. This is them trying to continue Western imperialism in Asia. They have all of these footholds that they're trying to maintain. That's what he's talking about. Hold the line. It's completely irrational and belligerent. This is not them underwriting peace and security. This is them underwriting their primacy over a region they're not even located on the map.
Yeah, and also ASPI, in addition to all these arms manufacturers, one of the largest donor to ASPI is United States State Department. So think about that. You know, this ostensibly Australian think tank is bankrolled by the United States State Department. You know, you can even question maybe where does his loyalty really lies. You know, like when he's talking about Australia must join the war with the U.S. against China when Australia literally has no stake in Taiwan. So
right, yeah, no, absolutely. We'll continue. We're almost towards the end of the video. We're at 37:57.
If you have the US going into harm's way to defend Taiwan, which after all, remember, is a fellow Western liberal democracy, just like Australia.
Stop right there. Stop right there. He just made a Freudian slip. He said Taiwan is a Western democracy, right? He just didn't say Taiwan is a fellow democracy. He said Taiwan is a fellow Western democracy. I mean, this is he's just slipping up, because what Taiwan is a client state to the United States. It's a proxy of the U.S. empire. That's what he really meant to say. But you can't say that. Instead, he say, "Oh, it's a Western democracy."
But even if that wasn't true, even if they weren't a client state and they were just a democracy, why are they a Western democracy? They're a democracy that exists in the East. Then no,
exactly.
I mean, it's and I think I didn't pick up on that when I watched it, and I think it is a valuable point, because it's like, what are you trying to do here? Again, it's trying to create the conditions where people are going to say, yes, we need to go to war for these people. We need to go to war if something happens in this region of the of our planet, because they're just like us. They're trying to make them relatable. When you sink PLA ships with hundreds of thousands of mainland Chinese people on it, that doesn't matter. We're not going to talk about the lives there, but now we're talking about people in Taiwan who have adopted our system, who are just like us, where they're relatable with us. It goes into this whole massaging of this public opinion to make the conditions ripe for manufacturing consent for this conflict, basically.
And another thing to point out is they keep talking about, if we were to say Australia, the UK, the US, we're not going to go to war if China took over Taiwan, then the status quo would be maintained. the government there in power right now would never even dream of declaring independence. It makes no sense. It's not in the best interest of Taiwan. It's not in the best interest of anyone, really. They would never do it. The status quo would stay in place, and inevitably they would rejoin the mainland. It's inevitable. Look at it economically. It's inevitable. And so the U.S., by saying, oh, we're going to back you, they're encouraging them to do something that's going to start a war. They are the ones provoking this. And he slipped up, because that's how they view Taiwan. It is their foothold. They don't care about democracy. I mean, it's a joke back at home. It's definitely not actually going on in Taiwan. And I mean, you could go and look at the Sunflower Revolution. It was another NED-backed color revolution to get this specific government in power, so that they were in power at this time in history where they need to pull the trigger on this before China irreversibly surpasses the West. That's what he's basically saying that too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that was a very valuable point to hone in on. So we got a little bit left towards the end here. Let's continue. So we're at 5:40:28.
They intend to take Taiwan by peace or by war. And the question is, what happens not just to the region, but to Australian society as a consequence?
This is actually what I forgot to mention also. I'm just pausing here at 41:03. They're constantly talking about this kind of a domino effect where, okay, so if China and Taiwan does reintegrate with each other for whatever reason, under whatever circumstances, that it will snowball and China will then take over the next place. But again, it's these vague concepts of where. I mean, where do you get this concept from? Where do you even have the basis to suggest something like that would happen? Give us some examples of where the next target would be. How would this happen? But they just, again, it's just this fear mongering without any actual logic underneath it all.
Oh, the Zhang actually made a claim that he said that's what the Chinese government told us. He just basically made up a lie right there, hoping you will never fact check. It's like, where did where did Xi Jinping say he will go next after he takes over Taiwan? Please, somebody tell me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're at 41:03, almost done. A few seconds left.
Hello, I'm Liz Hayes. Thanks for watching 60 Minutes Australia. Subscribe to our channel now for brand new stories and exclusive clips every week. And don't miss out on our extra...
This is so like melodramatic at the end, where it's like this. Well, not melodramatic. I mean, it's like an anticlimax. That's what I meant to say, where it's just this very casual thing. We hope you enjoyed crapping yourselves over the prospect of war. Don't forget to like and subscribe.
Did you notice the last picture? They were panning over the last picture was President Xi Jinping with Australian flags behind him and with the podium in front of him with the Australian seal on it. Like he got Taiwan. And then he just steamrolled, blitzkrieged into Australia. Now he's like doing his victory speech in Canberra. You have to look at it. That's what I think. That was like a subliminal message they were trying to send there. Like he finally did it. This is what this is the future.
Yeah, I was wondering what's all those stars on the flag behind Xi Jinping, but now that makes sense.
Yeah, that's.
Right there.
And then you see the kangaroo. You see the kangaroo. Yeah.
Good catch.
Oh yeah, that's good. That's good. I mean, so obviously there we go. All of this kind of subliminal messaging, the music plays into it, the way that they do it. It's an absolute fear-mongering piece. This isn't news anymore. I mean, this isn't news. This is meant to be entertainment, like a horror movie is entertainment. It's meant to scare audiences. It's meant to evoke emotion. It's definitely not considered nonfiction with the amount of lies that went into this. But I mean, this was done for people who don't examine these ideas and these topics as deep as we three do. I can understand how somebody would watch this and be really just scared out of their pants about this. So it's an excellent fear mongering piece in terms of if that was their actual goal. They really accomplished it. I think they toned it down a bit from their New Zealand one, which was just comical. It seemed like it could have been an onion piece. But this is genuinely, I could see how it could be very scary. I don't know what kinds of final thoughts you guys had on it.
Yeah, I mean,
Carl, do you want to go? You want to go first?
Sure. They just casually brought up that Australia is going to get nuked, and then please subscribe.
It is the weirdest thing. Brian, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, having been duped by this very sort of propaganda, I mean, this is exactly the sort of thing that I was brought up on. This is what got me to sign up to the military. This is what had me, waving an American flag when the troops were coming back from Desert Storm. So this is extremely dangerous. They are priming populations for war. I urge people to please read that Rand Corporation document. When you read that, all of this will make sense because they lay it out very explicitly how the war will be limited. They know they have more nuclear weapons than China. China would not want to escalate. If they attacked the homeland, that would just stir up a hornet's nest. They would keep it conventional. They would keep it limited. They would keep it to military targets and shipping lanes. They're going to try to cripple China's economy and set it back. We have to remember where we are in history. We are at a point where a non-white, non-Western nation is about to irreversibly surpass the West, economically, militarily, politically, with a completely different system, a completely different way of interacting with the world. Once they do so, there's no going back. We have to ask ourselves, what price would the U.S. be willing to pay? These people that have just cut a swath of death and destruction across now to 20th, 21st century. What price are they willing to pay to stop this from happening, to knock China down a peg and get a couple more decades of primacy over the Indo-Pacific region and the world? It's one of these points in history that we've arrived at.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you just have to imagine also and look back at what the U.S. did to specific regions like the Middle East, what lengths they went through to just control that specific region. But what we're talking about now is losing control over the planet, and losing control over the global south, having their corporations displaced by multiple options now. Now China's coming to the table with additional options. They don't only have this one single monopolistic choice with this what Noam Chomsky likes to call IMF fundamentalism. They now have multiple partners to choose from. Latin America, the U.S.'s previous stronghold, is increasingly choosing to deal with China. And even if they're skeptical about China's intentions, they know that China doesn't go in and assassinate their leaders, overthrow their governments, sponsor military coups. The U.S. has constantly throughout history deployed their military to protect American corporate interests, or even allied corporate interests, if in the case of Iran and overthrowing the government, to protect BP's interests there. From the beginning of American history, when guano was very important to to be used as fertilizer across America to support the growing population, the Navy, the military said they would literally go and protect merchants that were going into islands that belonged to South American countries to scrape the guano off of their islands for their commercial gain, for their purposes. So when China is rising, it displaces America in a way that you can imagine they're going to go through great lengths to do things. And I think people need to pay special attention to the kind of propaganda that's going on, because the conflict we could potentially be leading into is far bigger than the ones we've been tricked into before. I've had all the similar experiences that you did. I remember in Canada, they have this highway in Toronto that goes across Toronto called the 401 highway. There was, when I knew that they would be coming back with soldiers from Afghanistan, Canadian soldiers who had passed away, who had been killed in Afghanistan. When the cars were coming down the highway, I would go up to the highway bridge. I would stand in solidarity with everybody. And it was sad. It was sad that these people were sent to these meaningless wars. They were tricked into going. And I do feel sorry for them. But I was having those experiences, still feeling proud about what we were doing over there without thinking about it more meaningfully. It's time for people to wake up and there's so much more at stake this time around. I mean, if there was a time to wake up, it is now. Sorry, I've gone on for a little bit there, but I don't know if you guys had anything else you wanted to end on.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to comment on this particular show itself. It literally is trying to tell the public that we need to be in a war with China, with on the side of the United States, even if that means we're getting nuked. You know, they're presented as this is an inevitable choice. There's nothing you can do about it. This is just how is it going to happen? You're just going to deal with it. And this is just propaganda, you know, like Australia really did, you know, if Australia is a truly independent country, it has a choice to pursue its own best national interest. But, you know.
Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest takeaways for somebody who is Australian and who watches this is a takeaway perhaps that this documentary didn't want you to take away, but is what the hell is America doing with these bases in Australia that can do whatever they want? We have no control over them. And if they wanted to launch a war or start a war from Australian soil, there's very little we could do about it, providing that they presented those facts correctly. If that's the case, that would be the first thing that Australians should be protesting at this point, and realizing that, okay, so we're supposed to agree that potentially we're going to be nuked because we are going to stand by America's side, and America may drag this into us without any ability for us to say no to it, because they've got bases here that they could launch any attack that they want from. That is one of the most absurd things that was revealed in this documentary that I think people should take issue with if they're in Australia now.
Yeah, and think about it. They're saying they're upholding this international system of freedom and democracy. And it looks like, even by their own admission, Australia has no freedom to decide in this situation. They're being coerced. They're claiming China is this big threat, but they're admitting that the U.S. is already subjecting them to this. And they have a long list of wars they've been dragged into that has not benefited Australia. These are countries they have attacked that were not a threat to Australia in any shape, form, or way. They're blemishes on their history, and now they're being walked into another one. What kind of international system would do that to a supposed ally? Not even mentioning what they've done to all these other countries in the process.
Yeah, I mean, for all intents and purposes, Australia is a puppet of the U.S. right now. This should be something that Australian people should want to change, especially in the face of worrying that China may one day coerce them or, you know, lead them in a certain direction, while they are literally acting as America's puppet right now. That should be the pressing issue, not imagining how China might one day influence Australia or Australia's neighbors, but what kind of control America has over what should be an independent country that should be able to make decisions on their own. But yeah, if you guys, did you have anything you wanted to end on, Carl?
Yeah, I just want to say, you know, that those are the message for the Australian citizens watching this. But for any U.S. citizens who might be watching this, you know, this is we are being hyped up for war, for a place that many Americans couldn't find on a map, you know, or confuse it with Thailand. What the hell are we doing this for? You know, why are we willing to take some nukes for a place we can't even find on a map? You know, it shouldn't even matter to you what happens to Taiwan. Like, literally, your life will not change if the PRC integrates Taiwan. Your life will not change meaningfully. But yeah, if there is a nuclear exchange between United States and China, yes, I guarantee you your life will change for much, much worse. So, you know, What is the trade-off here? And again, you know, people need to be asking these questions, because otherwise the decisions will be made for us by these politicians, by these people with special interest. And they don't have your best interest in heart. Think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And even to this day, they probably still can't point 90% of Americans, and that's probably being generous, still can't point to Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan or Libya out on a map. And that's something that they should reflect on. But again, this one in particular with Taiwan that they keep mixing up with Thailand comes with far greater consequences for not really knowing what you're getting into yourself into and where it even is on the map.
Just one more thing about Taiwan. All the reasons they listed, they almost put it as a given that China will attack Taiwan anytime soon, which is decidedly not true. And all the reason they given for why China should take Taiwan, one of the reasons is China manufactures 60% of the world's semiconductor chips. That's not a reason for China to take over Taiwan, because most of that 60% of semiconductor chip that Taiwan produces is sold to mainland China. Either through to companies that does trade with China or sold to the mainland China company directly. But lately, because the Trump sanction that prevented them to sell these chips to mainland China, that actually makes a war more likely. So it's literally U.S. is trying to provoke a war right now over Taiwan. They're not doing. It's not China that's hell-bending on conquering Taiwan right now, this minute, because they're like Brian already mentioned, there's a lot of economic integration already happening. But it's a U.S. administration that's intentionally try to break this economic linkage between mainland China and Taiwan, and that's to make the war scenario more likely. Think about that, and this is all done, to further the interest of the military-industrial complex. That brings no tangible benefits to the average Americans. Only the downside.
Sorry, go ahead.
Just
Brian.
Just the last thing. The reason why we're up at midnight or 1 a.m. on a Friday night, we have families here in Asia. We're taking time away from our families here in Asia, where this is all going to unfold. We already have seen the consequences of this firsthand. Daniel in Hong Kong, here in Bangkok, they've got these U.S.-backed mobs. Carl, I don't know if you've seen anything there, but this is why we do this. We've seen this before. We know where this leads. We know it's only going to be suffering, death, and destruction if it does unfold. If you're not in Asia, it's going to be, if you're a Westerner, it's going to be American, British, Australians going off to die in this pointless war. Another pointless war that you're getting hyped up for. And then in the wake of it, you're going to find out that it was all a bunch of lies, that you were tricked again. How many times do they have to do this before people start to wake up? And my last message to people is, please resist this, spread this information around, get involved in whichever way you can. There's no minor way to get involved. It all adds up, and it's just imperative that we get ahead of this. This is an inflection point for all of history. We have to avoid this, because there is no good outcome when this happens. There is only if we avoid it is the outcome going to be good.
Yeah, definitely. I'm right now in Bali, Indonesia, and here where I live, there are still bodies from the 1965 CIA-sponsored coup that was killed and still buried in the tourist visited beaches. A lot of the tourists who come to Bali, they don't know all these big beaches that visit. They were used as mass graves back in 1965, 1966. A lot of the bodies killed were being buried up there, and that was the consequences of the U.S. empire interference in Southeast Asia. So I don't want to see that happen again.
Yeah, I think definitely there are people who are in the countries who are affected by these kinds of things who appreciate these lessons a bit more than the people in the West who have had this stuff isolated from them far enough away where it hasn't affected them personally. This is a whole different ball game. I think adding to your point about Taiwan, Carl, that is something I've been thinking about a lot also. I was thinking from a strategic point of view, what would be the reason for an invasion? What would be the reason for a takeover? And it all points back to this instigation. I didn't think about the angle that you were talking about, but I think inevitably once America regroups itself and China is such a big target, I can almost guarantee that they're going to run operations from Taiwan against China. They've done it before, like I said, during the Korean War. And that is a very, very vulnerable point that's just 100 miles off the coast of China. And they could be provoked into doing something there. So I think backing off and approaching this in a little bit more of a level-headed way, people need to do, because they need to realize they're tricking themselves into the very situations that will lead into what nobody wants to be led into. I think in terms of action items, people definitely need to speak up about it. They need to, try to prevent this escalation. There was, I don't know if this is the right screenshot here. Let me see here. Yeah, this is like Article 20. I was talking to Brian about this. There's a Article 20 in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Any propaganda for war shall be prohibited by law. A lot of countries signed on to that, but America and a lot of global North countries have not. And I think they realize this because to maintain the current global order and maintain their empire, sometimes they're going to need to go to war in order to do that. By signing up for that and making sure that there are consequences for this kind of war propaganda, there's no guarantee they'll actually follow it. But adding that is a really good possible solution. Making sure that the military-industrial complex cannot fund organizations that are ultimately going to affect public opinion or public policy is probably a good starting point too. That is a scary conflict of interest. Or being able to lobby your politicians. The fact that the military-industrial complex that profits on war has their hands in all of these pockets to be able to make the decisions to create a war where they will eventually profit is just absurd. That's something that needs to end as well. And go as far as saying that if these people are posting on Twitter who work for these companies, they need to say military-industrial complex funded, activist or whatever it is. Like I said, if you've got to put Chinese state media on it, I think that's an even more important one to put on. But I don't know exactly what the solutions are, but I'm hoping that some of the people listening to what we explored here, what we're talking about, our concerns, some people that are even more talented more talented than we are can come up with some even better solutions. But there's definitely something that needs to be done here because we're being led into potentially a pretty big disaster here. And this was an excellent piece of propaganda to really exemplify that point. But I think, yeah, sorry, Carl, go ahead.
Sorry, I just one last thing about Taiwan. It's the reason why China has less incentive to start a war with Taiwan is because China's star is rising right now. China's power is growing with time, and there are plenty of talks among the U.S. national security establishment about the time to do something to prevent China's rise is right now, because there's a limited time window when U.S. is still militarily powerful enough to try to stop China's rise. Whereas in 20 years, China will have escaped the orbit of the U.S. military powers to contain China, because that's why China has everything to gain by taking its time with Taiwan, whereas U.S. has, or for the warmongers in the U.S. national security establishment, they have more incentive to instigate something in Taiwan in the more immediate future, because many of them fear that in 10, 20 years, no matter what U.S. does, what has no very limited impact when it comes to China's options, say in Taiwan. So they decide to instigate trouble rather now than 15, 10, 20 years down the road.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a very good point that people need to keep in mind also. And I think if there are some people who are reluctant to say anything, or they're complacent because they think that the West keeping their hegemonic power over the world comes with some sort of benefit for the ordinary person in the West, it doesn't. I mean, these wealth transfers that happen during these conflicts, it perpetuates the system that's in place now, that is a system that has an increasing wealth gap that's at record highs in the U.S., that has record levels of poverty that continues to increase. I mean, what the people protested at Occupy Wall Street, they were protesting against the 1%. And now if they fall in line with these narratives to allow the U.S. to wage war so that their corporations can continue their monopolistic power over the world, inadvertently, these same people who supported Occupy Wall Street are now supporting the narratives and the intentions of the very people who they previously recognized as their oppressors or the problematic aspects of society. I mean, going on board with this allows these kinds of people to keep power who are doing nothing for their ordinary people. And that also comes with the additional side benefit of diverting your attention away from your own problems at home, many there are, onto an external enemy. I mean, this is a constant playbook that they use also. When there's issues at home, divert your attention to something abroad. And that's what people are being fooled into right now. So I want to say that to people who may say, okay, this is wrong, I can see through it, but at the end of the day, the West needs to stay as the sole hegemonic power. Without this, multilateral society, we need to be the global power. It comes with no benefits to the ordinary person. So if you're an ordinary person watching this, you have no reason, you have no benefit to support these kinds of aggressions also. So yeah, Brian, I don't know if you had any final comments before we go.
Just thank you for having me on. Carl, it was great to finally meet you. I really admire your work, as I admire Daniel. So it's like really great to be here together to get into this, and we'll just keep doing it. Keep doing everything we can. What else can we do?
Yeah, absolutely. We can maybe do another one that doesn't quite go for 3.5 hours.
Yeah.
But I think this was something we needed to do. I got so many messages even while we were doing this. But we'll wrap it up here before it hits 1 a.m. on our clock. Thank you guys for joining. This was really important, and hopefully we'll see each other together again soon. And thank you everybody else, the viewers who managed to make it this far into the video. So we'll see you next time. See ya.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Brian.